Tractate Chullin covers the various complex laws of kosher and the proper slaughter of animals. Chapter 1 begins on the laws of slaughtering an animal. The first Mishnah says, anybody can validly slaughter an animal besides for a deaf-mute, an insane person, or a minor, out of concern that they might mess up the act of slaughter. They would be allowed to do so if somebody is watching them. The Gemara debates, based on the wording, as to if anybody's slaughter is permitted initially or only after the fact. For instance, in a later tractate, Timura, it says all can substitute animals for consecrated ones using similar wording, but that's different, as later in that Mishnah, it specifically qualifies it's only valid after the fact. There's also the later Mishnah that all can declare an erech vow. There too it concludes that it's only permissible after the fact, so it said the expression all can do something could really mean either way, depending on the context. The issue here is that our Mishnah afterwards said their slaughter is valid, as a clarification of a sort, implying it would only be permissible after the fact. So there are a few different answers. The first is that this unique wording is to teach that all can slaughter animals prepared at the same level of consecrated food, even an impure person, so long as he's very careful to not touch the animal. This could be possible if he uses a long knife, for instance. However, as mentioned, this isn't preferable and would only be valid after the fact. Then, when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person could not slaughter an animal, that means they can't at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. As for the impure person, he would need to state that he hadn't touched the animal, but if he is not there to be asked, as mentioned at the end of the Mishnah, we would need people who watched him to testify to this. There's a related principle on this discussed earlier in Tractate Chullin. As for the type of impurity being discussed in this case, it has to be where the person was impure from a sheretz creature as opposed to a corpse, as otherwise he just makes the knife itself impure and then the meat impure. That's one explanation. A second explanation is that it meant all can slaughter, including a Kuthian, so long as somebody's watching him. If he's unmonitored, we check to see if he'd eat any of the meat himself, as to whether it's allowed. Then when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person couldn't slaughter an animal, that meant that they can't at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. But then, what does the last part refer to about them being monitored, as we already brought that by the case of the Kuthian. So there are other posed issues in addition to this from earlier discussions in Tractate Avodah Zarah. We know that if somebody is being monitored intermittently, walking in and out of the room, they can be relied on in the first place. So this is apparently contradictory, so we bring the third explanation. It means all can slaughter, even a Kuthian, where he's being monitored intermittently. But if somebody finds he's already slaughtered the animal, we check to see if he'll eat it. Then, when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person couldn't slaughter an animal, that meant that they can't do so at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. But then again, what does the last part refer to about them being monitored, as we already brought that by the Kuthian? So, a fourth explanation, it means all can slaughter, even a renegade, which is somebody who habitually violates certain commandments here of eating improperly slaughtered animals out of desire. Now, that would be permissible if you gave him a pre-examined knife, but if you just find he slaughtered the animal, you should examine the knife afterwards, and if it's fine with no nicks, which would have made it impermissible, it's permitted. Again, the prohibitions by a mentally incompetent person here are in case they mess up the slaughter. But then what does the last part refer to about them being monitored? As apparently just checking the knife is an option. So a fifth explanation, what I meant was all can slaughter if they're proficient in the laws of slaughter, meaning they can recite the relevant laws and are not just established at being skilled. If they didn't recite the laws and they slaughtered an animal after the fact, we test to see if they can recite the laws to see if it'll be allowed. Again, mentally incompetent people are disallowed. But then what does the last part refer to about them being monitored? As apparently we can just test their knowledge. So a sixth final explanation, it means all can slaughter an animal if they're established as skilled, which is done by properly slaughtering 2 or 3 times in our presence. If he hadn't done this and slaughtered an animal and then testifies that he hadn't fainted or something, it's valid after the fact. Mentally incompetent people are banned from this as mentioned. Then when it mentions the man being monitored, that specifically applied to a case where the man isn't available to testify that he hadn't fainted. It explains why each of them disagrees with the other opinions. By the first opinion, it's that some disagree with the premise and say that an ordinary animal just isn't treated with the same status as a consecrated animal. Then people who disagree with the final explanations is that they hold anybody slaughtering an animal is presumed to be proficient, and that there's no concern of fainting. Regarding the opinion that by the case of a Kuthian, that was as mentioned, that others disagree, as they say an intermittent guardian is sufficient, and so on, as there's certain linguistic issues with the remaining cases. Related, we said that a Kuthian is believed to have slaughtered properly if he's monitored, or if he's willing to eat of the animal. I quote sources for this. It said this applies to a string of birds too, having the man eat one of the birds, and there's no concern of that specific bird he chose being the one that was slaughtered properly, as they were mixed up and any potential identifying marks were removed. This is all essentially based on a dispute regarding the people of ancient Samaria, as mentioned, the Kuthians, who kept the laws of the Torah, but were not always so reliable in matters not explicitly stated within the Torah. However, it is stated, if the Kuthians had established a practice amongst themselves, they would end up being far more meticulous in it than the rest of the Jewish people. So there's a dispute if the Kuthians were reliable with something not explicitly stated in the Torah, but that was established amongst themselves. Regarding the case of the renegade, who frequently ate improperly slaughtered food, the reason it's permitted for him to slaughter, if his knife is examined, is that he may as well properly slaughter the animal there as opposed to doing it improperly, as his knife is proper. It's just that he wouldn't go out of his way to fetch a new knife if his current one was impermissible. I'll quote a number of sources for this principle. It's also said, if somebody is a renegade in regards to frequently committing idolatry, it's still allowed to eat of animals he slaughtered, which is seen in some cases in scripture, wherein Yehoshaphat ate meat prepared by Achav. That's discussed, explaining particularities of the case. This goes further and it quotes additional sources for this principle. However, it is disproven, as from a related case regarding idolatrous libations. It proves that somebody who's a renegade to commit idolatry is assumed to be a renegade against the entire Torah. It quotes further locations where this is sourced. It also explains the actual voting on the case as to whether the slaughtering of Kuthians was permitted. This is additionally discussed, quoting some relevant verses. It's said that the Kuthians were at one point given the status as complete idol worshippers in regards to courtyard ownership rights due to their frequent practice of idolatry. It cites related points as to whether there's concern when eating food prepared by an ignoramus of a lack of tithing or other kosher issues. Incidents on this topic are quoted demonstrating the concept that if somebody is righteous, they won't come to even accidentally eat forbidden food. It additionally discusses this in some particular cities as to whether they have this particular concern of a lack of tithing within them, along with some additional incidents. There's further discussion and some related points saying that the righteous, when dead, are even greater than when they were alive, as seen by certain prophets like Elijah. It's also said that no illness or affliction, not even sorcery, can harm somebody who God hasn't decreed punishment against. Again, incidents demonstrating this are quoted. A related rule about the laws of slaughter: if somebody superheated a knife and slaughtered with it, it's still valid, as its sharpness precedes the heat, and the sides of the knife don't burn anything as the incision spreads apart with the knife. This has relevance if somebody struck somebody with a heated piece of metal and a leprosy wound developed there, as to whether this constitutes an inflammation or a burn. There's a difference, as these two variants don't combine to form the minimum size to affect impurity. It additionally expands on this list regarding laws of leprosy. It said it's different than our knife case, as it's a blunt object here, not a knife, so it remains unresolved. Regarding a knife used for idolatry, it's said it's permissible to slaughter with it, as it damages an animal, but it cannot be used to cut meat, which causes an actual improvement. So slaughtering an animal with an idolatrous knife would be forbidden if the animal was dangerously sick, as that's an improvement, and you can cut meat with such a knife if you're ruining a particular cut of meat. Also, this only applies if the knife was never used on actual non-kosher meats, which it could then absorb, meaning it was only used to cut wood or something, or it was used on non-kosher meats, but it was made kosher and cleansed by being purged. Somewhat similarly, if somebody slaughters using a knife owned by a non-Jewish person, some say out of concern the knife absorbed non-kosher foods, that the parts that came in contact with the knife must be cut off. Others say it could just be washed off. This dispute is either based on whether absorption will occur, or possibly not, as the pipes are expelling blood, so it won't be able to absorb anything. Alternatively, it's a debate as to whether absorption will occur due to the pressure of the knife. Related, if a knife was used to slaughter an animal with a fatal physical defect, it's said it's enough to just wash it in cold water, or even to just wipe it down. This is as the animal was kosher, it's just impermissible due to the defect, which is only viewed after the slaughter. Related, a butcher needs 3 separate knives, one for slaughter, one to cut meat, and one to cut out forbidden fats. Technically, you could just have 2 and cut forbidden fats last, but 3 were instituted to prevent any mistakes, meaning the knives must also have individual identifying marks. Similarly, a butcher must also have 2 separate vessels of water, one to wash meats and one for forbidden fats, both with identifying marks for the same reason. It's also said that a flank of meat with attached forbidden fat shouldn't be held above other meats in case the fats drip down and become absorbed. This doesn't apply to the actual meat it's attached to, as it's separated by a membrane, unlike the lower piece which had the membrane rubbed off. It's also said a Torah scholar must learn 3 things: writing, slaughter, and circumcision. Some add how to tie tefillin, how to say the wedding blessings, and how to tie tzitzis, although those were more common. Also, if somebody frequently slaughtered properly, but it's found that he doesn't know the laws of slaughter, which will be expounded on more later, you cannot eat from him. It's also said that a butcher must inspect the trachea and esophagus after slaughter to make sure he did it properly, which it sources. If this isn't done, it's a debate as to what status, if non-kosher, the animal has. This is qualified. Some hold an animal is presumed to be forbidden until it's confirmed that the animal was slaughtered properly. There are additional points on this. It also brings up a related prohibition that you shouldn't drink water that was left out overnight due to some safety concerns. Now, if somebody slaughtered using a knife and afterwards much later realized that his knife has a nick, then that much earlier slaughter is invalid, even if between then he was using the knife to crush bones, which presumably caused the nick. Others disagree and say the slaughter is fine, as we assume it got nicked from the crushing of the bones, so it's an uncertainty which doesn't change the thing's status. It debates this from other cases. Although it is ruled if somebody wasn't breaking bones with a knife in between slaughter, we assume the knife was nicked by the slaughter, and it's invalid. And if there were bones broken in between, we assume that's what caused the nick, and the slaughter is valid. It quotes related cases. It's also said some require a knife to be inspected in between every slaughter of every animal, and it argues who this is in accordance with. It also quotes sources of the principle that, unless proven otherwise, a status is presumed to remain unchanged. While we're here, it also quotes the source for the concept that we follow majority, even if it's not directly in front of us. It quotes a number of opinions, which are discussed. Further sources for this concept are quoted. Anyways, if somebody is monitoring another man's slaughter of the animal, he needs to watch him from beginning to end. This applies if the slaughterer isn't knowledgeable on the laws of slaughter, so it's saying, even if you witness the man sever the first pipe properly, you still can't presume he'll do the second pipe properly too. Related, it said if somebody sends an agent to slaughter his animal and then goes and finds that it was slaughtered, he can assume it was done properly. However, then he says that if somebody sends an agent to separate his tithes and then finds his tithes have been separated, he cannot assume it was done properly. So let's explain the differences. The concern is that somebody else, instead of the agent, slaughtered the animal or separated the produce first, and it's only by slaughtering of animals that we assume most people that do this act know what they're doing. Although the same principle that most people who slaughter animals are assumed to be proficient is actually a disputed point. Anyways, we had stated that everybody can slaughter animals besides for mentally incompetent people, so deaf mutes, insane people, or minors. Based on the choice of wording, it said that they're prohibited from doing this even while supervised in the first place. Then we said that if they did wind up slaughtering the animal, but they were monitored and they did everything properly, it's valid. Evidently, this opinion rejects the concept that there's a requirement to have specific intents while slaughtering an animal. Besides for this, though, the slaughter must have been done properly. Although related, it's a debate if a minor is even capable of having legally significant thought or action. It's debated, and it concludes that minors can perform a legally significant act biblically, but not rabbinically. Regarding a minor's thought that are evident from his actions, biblically this has no significance, but rabbinically it does. It quotes the source from scripture for the point that the slaughter of an animal requires proper intent, New Mishnah. If a non-Jewish person slaughtered an animal, we assume it wasn't done properly in accordance with the laws of Kosher, and the animal could also convey impurity. The Gemara says this implies that an animal slaughtered by a non-Jewish person could still be benefited from, although others say that if a pagan worshipper slaughtered an animal, we automatically assume it was done for idolatry and cannot be used. Anyways, it also tries to derive that an animal slaughtered by an idolatrous priest is assumed to be used for idolatry and therefore prohibited from benefit. It expands on the list of things forbidden from such a person. Although it is stated that most non-Jewish people don't have this status, some even say that none of them did, and some say that most of the people committing idolatry out in the world in this time period weren't doing so because they really believed in it, they just were doing so out of tradition. Although it does say that we fully accept vow and gift offerings towards the temple equally, whether they were from Jewish people or non-Jewish people. It also explains the point on the animal's impurity contamination. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered an animal at night, or if a blind person slaughtered an animal, it's valid. The Gemara says this is only valid after the fact, and it should not be done initially, although slaughter at night is fine if there's a torch to see by. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, there's a liability of capital punishment for doing this. However, the slaughter was still valid. The Gemara says, nevertheless, the meat cannot be eaten until the Shabbos is over, due to issues of it being prepared at the wrong time. It additionally discusses the logic of this principle. It further argues sources on this as to why exactly this meat is prohibited over Shabbos. It additionally describes alternative sources for this principle. Related incidents on this topic are quoted. It does say, unlike slaughtering on Shabbos, cooking food on Shabbos, while also forbidden, is treated differently. So if somebody slaughtered an animal on Shabbos for a very sick person, which is allowed, a healthy person can chew the meat while it's raw, as there's nothing extra being made for him. But if somebody cooks food on Shabbos for a very sick man, a healthy person cannot have any, in case anything extra got prepared for him. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal using the blade of a sickle, flint, or with a sharpened reed, it's valid. All are slaughtered. We always slaughter, and we slaughter anything. That's an expression that's going to be explained soon. Besides for a serrated harvesting sickle, a saw, animal teeth, or a nail, as those tear as opposed to cut. Essentially, a proper knife for slaughter cannot have any serration on it whatsoever. The Gemara debates as to if this implies that using a sickle blade, flint, or sharp reed is permissible only after the fact. Not initially. It discusses this from a number of cases. Related, it said that it is valid to slaughter using a wheel mechanism contraption as long as it's operated manually and not through hydraulic force. Alternatively, it's just invalid to use a secondary force. Anyways, it additionally debates whether a knife attached to the ground is permissible, along with related discussion on items, if they're considered attached or detached, and how that relates to some laws of impurity. So if something was originally detached from the ground and then became attached, it debates this from several cases. For instance, it said if a knife is embedded into a wall and used to slaughter, it's valid, although only if the animal was below the knife, as there can't be a pressing force in slaughter, only a cutting action. It's also said that slaughter using a reed stem is prohibited, among other actions, although it is said to be dependent on the type of reed. When the Mishnah said all are slaughtered, that means all animals and birds must be slaughtered. When it said we always slaughter, that means even in exile, meat is permitted only if the animal is slaughtered properly. There's slight variation on this last one as to if before exile, when the Jewish people were wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, whether meat was permitted at all or if it required proper slaughter. These principles are debated from a number of sources. Some suggest that proper slaughter of animals wasn't even required prior to entering the land of Israel. Regarding animals that were killed prior to entering Israel and were then kept around until after the conquering, it's unresolved if those were allowed to be eaten. When the Mishnah said we slaughter with anything, that's disputed. Some reinterpret the whole quote and say all may slaughter, as mentioned twice, includes a Kuthian and a renegade. Then it said we always slaughter, that meant by day or by night, and even on top of a roof or a boat. And then when it said we slaughter with anything, that referred to with flint, glass, or a reed stem. Regarding the sickle or saw, it describes the serrations and notches and explains how they're impermissible or possibly not, depending on the shape of the notch. Essentially, it said if somebody runs their fingernail along the blade to check, and there's a notch with 2 points, like a V, like this, it's invalid, as is any slaughter done with it. If the notch is only in one direction, meaning it's a gradual slope, and then drops to a sharp point, it shouldn't be used initially, but if it was used, it's valid, although only if it's moved in one direction without being pulled towards the serrated bit. If the notch is a gradual slope in both directions, it's valid even initially. It also sources the principle that a knife for slaughter must be checked before use. It describes methods of this, some saying it must be lightly tested against your flesh and nail to ensure its sharpness and lack of edge, and some say this is required on all 3 sides of the blade. Others say testing all 3 sides isn't required, as mentioned by superheating a knife, the flesh spreads out as it cuts. On the topic of notches, there are other types of notches that have legal significance besides for a slaughtering knife that will create prohibitions. Notches in the bone of a paschal offering, in the ear of a firstborn animal, and as a blemish on a sacrificial animal. The size of these notches to be significant must be equal to the same size as a notch in the stones of the altar that would create an invalidation within. This is a notch large enough that it would stop a fingernail passing by it. It was said that a slaughterer must submit his knife to the sages to ensure that it didn't have any disqualifying nicks, and it's said if somebody doesn't do this, he has a ban placed on him. Others say if this occurs and his knife is found to be flawed, he's fired, and we say his meat is non-kosher. Others say we're harsher and we destroy his meat so he cannot sell it to anybody, even to a non-Jewish person. It quotes incidents of this. Unlike a single tooth or an attached nail, which we said are impermissible for slaughter, it said 2 detached teeth or a detached nail are permissible even in the first place. New Mishnah. If somebody is slaughtered using a serrated harvesting sickle in only one direction, Beis Hillel says it's valid, Beis Shammai disagrees. If it was filed down to be smooth, it's treated like a knife. The Gemara says possibly when Beis Hillel says it was allowed, they only meant that it didn't give off impurity. It still couldn't be eaten from, though. This is debated from some sources. New Mishnah. Now on the actual locations of slaughter, essentially the pipes that must be cut are the trachea and esophagus. However, there is a certain limit as to where you can cut until, and if you go past this, the slaughter is invalid. You're supposed to sever right through the trachea. However, somebody tilted the knife slightly and wound up finishing the cut slightly above the cricoid cartilage. Is a debate. Some say it's invalid, others say it's fine, as majority was done through the trachea. The Gemara says we hold like this latter opinion, although it would be invalid if any of the lower cartilage rings were severed, as only this cricoid cartilage entirely surrounds the trachea. Others dispute this and say that would be a valid location for slaughter, although it's ruled to be impermissible. Related cases of this are cited. Anyways, it's argued as to if cutting through the actual thyroid cartilage is valid, or if that's too far. If the corniculate cartilage was severed, it's a debate if that makes the animal invalid. It's ruled from the point where the thyroid cartilage curves upward and down is valid, and if the corniculate cartilage was severed, it would also be valid. The basis for this is cited. Regarding the debate as to if cutting slightly above the cricoid cartilage would invalidate the slaughter of an animal, this dispute is defined as cutting through 2/3 of the trachea properly and then the last third above it, essentially debating as to whether it's sufficient. If the cut is through less of the trachea than this, it's agreed to be invalid. Others actually define the case as the opposite, that the first third was too high and the last 2/3 properly went through the trachea, essentially debating as to whether if the first part of the laceration was made in the wrong place, if it can be adjusted properly. They would agree if the last third shifted too far upwards, it's valid. There's variation on this quoted dispute. Now, if somebody made a cut a third too high up, then a third properly, And then the last third went too high up. It's a debate if it's kosher or not. The debate is, as some say, the part in the middle was proper, and that's what actually killed the animal. The other opinion says majority of the cut needs to be done properly. If a third was cut properly, a third was too high, and a third was proper, it was also debated if this is valid or not. Further on in this case, where the middle part of the cut was too high above the trachea, there are additional opinions as to whether or not this is valid. Some would rule that if only the middle is within the right area, it's valid. They also say if there's a tear halfway through the trachea, the slaughterer can finish the cut and it would be valid. If the pre-existing tear was in the back of the trachea, it's said to be invalid to cut until you reach it. The logic is that it's comparable to an act of slaughter that was finished by somebody who is not allowed to slaughter animals, but others dispute this comparison, saying there's no difference from the former case, where it's the other way around. New Mishnah. Unlike typical methods of slaughter, specifically by temple bird offerings, they were not slaughtered with a knife, but rather through a process called malika, which involved the Kohen pressing his thumbnail through the neck of the bird. Slaughter by animals from the sides of the neck is valid, but malika cannot be done from the sides of the neck. Slaughter by animals at the nape is invalid, but it is valid by malika. Animal slaughter from the throat is valid, but it would be invalid by malika. This is as animal slaughter is done by the throat and malika is done by the nape, and you cannot do this the other way around. The Gemara defines the word for nape, and it brings sources. During the process of malika, the Kohen uses his fingers to shift the neck pipes to the back of the neck, so only those get severed. It's debated if this was optional or a required step. That's discussed. It's also said that malika should be one straight motion, so it's debated if moving the thumb back and forth would invalidate the slaughter. It implies that it would not be valid. Some say that anywhere on the neck that's exactly opposite where the animal was slaughtered is where malika could be done. This is to invalidate malika done above the permitted area by the head, but angled down so that way it went into the neck. This is the same principle as mentioned earlier by an animal, that a cut a third too high and 2/3 in the permitted area is invalid. Related, there's a dispute as to whether slaughter of a bird that's neck pipes were dislocated is permissible, based on whether the proper slaughter of a bird is a principle of rabbinic or biblical law. That's a disputed point. Additionally, it's said if an animal's neck bone and most of the flesh is broken, is viewed as if it died without proper slaughter, not just as if it had a defect. The same principle existed in the middle of the earlier tractate, Zevachim, saying an offering bird slaughtered with a knife instead of malika is not considered to have been slaughtered. There's suggested reasons. Some say as the knife gets burrowed under the neck bone, others say because the knife only presses straight down without moving to the sides. They disagree based on what they hold is or is not an invalidating principle. According to this quoted opinion that an animal is considered dead once its neck bone and most of its flesh is broken, it's argued as to what the point of malika even is, as the pipes by the bird would be cut last in this case. It's explained that malika must be similar to ordinary slaughter and that these pipes too must be cut. Additionally, to make it that you're not just doing malika on a dead bird, the spine could be severed, but majority of the flesh cannot. It quotes some related points on a person with a similar severe neck injury as to how this would apply by laws of impurity. If an animal is split in two, it's automatically considered as if it was improperly slaughtered. The same would apply if the thigh bone and all of its flesh were removed up to the joint. There are further points on laws of impurity. There's a related quote regarding verses which compares the bird ola and the animal chatas offerings. This comparison teaches that the two have the same features in that they're only offered of consecrated animals, they're only offered by day, and the service is done with the right hand. By the bird ola offering, however, both pipes must be severed during malika. Others say, actually, the comparison is with the bird chatas, and it's to teach that malika is done by the nape by both. However, by the bird chatas, only the first pipe is cut, unlike by the ola. Others say the comparison is between a bird ola and a bird chatas to teach that the blood by both of these are sprayed as the head is still attached to the body. A question to the sources for all these. New Mishnah. Regarding bird offerings, what's done with turtle doves is not done with pigeons, and what's done with pigeons is not done with turtle doves. By both birds during the period of adulthood where their neck feathers turn yellow, they're invalid. The Gemara says, further, by turtle doves, they're valid as offerings when they're adults, while pigeons must be brought when they're young. Sources for these principles are quoted. It's also said that young pigeons are required, newborn pigeons were impermissible as offerings, and it defines these ages. Related, it's asked, what if somebody vows to bring an ola bird offering but brings birds within that stage where the feathers are yellowing, if that's permissible as to if it could be a questionable status? It said they're considered improper, as are birds used for bestiality or idol worship, which it quotes sources on. Similarly, if somebody vows to bring an ola offering of a ram or a lamb and brings a palgas, which is some animal that's possibly one of these or possibly a third category, it's debated and it remains unresolved. Similar dispute exists by somebody offering to bring a toda offering and then brings partially leavened bread, which again stands unresolved. New Mishnah. What's valid for the red heifer offering is invalid for the egla arufa ceremony, and what's valid for the egla arufa ceremony is invalid for the red heifer. The Gemara explains the red heifer is only valid if it's killed through slaughter, while the egla arufa is only valid if it's beheaded. Sources for this are quoted. New Mishnah, what's fit for Kohanim is unfit for Levium, and what's fit for Levium is unfit for Kohanim. The Gemara explains, Kohanim can get disqualified by blemishes, while Levium are disqualified by age. Sources for this are quoted, and it discusses additionally defining these age limits. It also gives minimum age requirements for the service of Kohanim and Levium. New Mishnah, what's pure by earthenware utensils is impure by other utensils, and what's pure by other utensils is impure by earthenware utensils. The Gemara explains that if something impure is suspended even in the airspace of an earthenware utensil, it's impure, but if it touches only the exterior surface, it's pure. The inverse is applied by other utensils. Sources are quoted, and these are discussed. New Mishnah, what's pure by wooden utensils is impure by metal utensils, and what's pure by metal utensils is impure by wooden utensils. The Gemara explains, unfinished wooden utensils are impure, while flat wooden utensils are pure. The inverse applies by metal utensils. Examples of unfinished wooden utensils are given. The same is done for metal utensils. Unadorned wooden utensils are considered complete, while unadorned metal utensils are considered incomplete, possibly as metal utensils are made for prestige, possibly as they're expensive. There's a practical difference between these by bone utensils, which were only expensive. New Mishnah, what's subject to tithing by bitter almonds is exempt by sweet almonds. The same applies vice versa. The Gemara explains, by bitter almonds, only sweet ones were subject to tithing, while sweet almonds have only the large ones be subject to tithing. Others disagree and say all small almonds are exempt. Those that say large bitter almonds can be tithed as they can be sweetened to be considered like food. New Mishnah, unfermented grapeseed wine cannot be purchased with second tithe money, and it would disqualify a mikvah if it's poured into it. Fermented grapeseed wine can be purchased with second tithe money, and it does not disqualify a mikvah if poured in. Regarding brothers who are partners in owning their father's estate, they need to pay the additional kolban tax in addition to the half shekel, and they're exempt from the animal tithe. If they're obligated to pay the animal tithe, they're exempt from the kolban tax. The Gemara disputes who authored this based on individually held opinions. It further explains the principles of this grapeseed wine as to when it would disqualify a mikvah, along with principles of tithes. That's discussed. New Mishnah, so long as a girl is permitted to be sold by her father as a maidservant, there's no fine paid to her father by a violator or a seducer. If there is a fine, she cannot be sold. The Gemara says others disagree and say there would be a fine paid either way. New Mishnah, if a girl is refusing miyun, an arranged marriage, there's no eligibility for chalitza. If there's eligibility for chalitza, there's no miyun. The Gemara says this is just one opinion. Others say miyun can even be done when chalitza can be done. New Mishnah, whenever a holiday immediately precedes or follows a Shabbos, if there was a horn blast to announce the beginning of Shabbos, there would be no Havdalah service after Shabbos. If a holiday falls out on Shabbos Eve, the horn would be sounded, and there would be no Havdalah. If the holiday immediately follows Shabbos, we say Havdalah, but sound no horn. A specific Havdalah prayer is said to separate between Shabbos and a holiday, which is this. The Gemara explains how these horn blasts sounded, and further quotes the exact unique Havdalah prayer between Shabbos and a holiday. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Chullin continues covering the laws of kosher and the slaughter of animals. The first Mishnah says, a bird is slaughtered by cutting only one pipe, the trachea or esophagus, while an animal is slaughtered by severing both pipes. Cutting the majority of a pipe is sufficient. Rabbi Yehuda says, by a bird, cutting the jugular vein is required. He also says cutting half of one pipe by a bird, or 1.5 pipes by an animal, would be invalid, but more than half would be sufficient. The Gemara says, based on the wording, it possibly means that cutting only one pipe by a bird is sufficient only after the fact, or it means that cutting majority of a pipe is sufficient after the fact. It also quotes scriptural sources that slaughtering is done in this method specifically by severing parts of the throat as opposed to through the heart or otherwise. A number of these are brought. Additional sources are cited from even more locations throughout scripture. It sources that this applies by animals and birds, but fish are actually exempt from the requirement of slaughter. Some said that animals are created of dry land, so they must have 2 pipes severed. Fish were made of water, so they don't need to be slaughtered, and birds were made out of mud, so they only need 1 pipe slaughtered. This is additionally discussed. Anyways, it was taught that if somebody improperly slaughtered an animal, he's exempt from covering the blood. Evidently, by a bird, it's said to be sufficient to pierce its pipes, making it biblically allowed to be eaten, and its blood must be covered. This does not contradict our Mishnah, as that refers to a non-domesticated bird specifically. Others dispute this, and it discusses it quoting a number of sources. Anyways, regarding bird slaughter, some say either the esophagus or trachea can be severed. Some say it has to be at least the esophagus that's severed, which is a dispute based on a verse. This is argued from a few different cases. In the end, it proved from a quoted case that either pipe being severed would be sufficient. Rabbi Yehuda said that cutting the jugular by a bird is necessary to drain the blood. Some say this isn't necessary by an animal, as it's anyways being cut into pieces. Others dispute this principle. Anyways, if one of the pipes is exactly halfway severed, it's a dispute. Some say it's treated as if it's fully severed. Some say it's considered to not be severed based on individual traditions. This dispute applies biblically, as our Mishnah, which required the majority to be severed, refers to rabbinically. It argues this from several cases. These are additionally discussed. It repeated the fact that cutting majority of an animal's pipe is sufficient 2 times to show this applies by both consecrated and unconsecrated animals, as by consecrated animals the blood is specifically needed. It explains which statement in our Mishnah was used to refer to which of these. There are a few opinions on this. There's a related discussion as to whether the actual act of slaughter is classified as the very end of the act, or if the entire process is considered the act of slaughter. This is disputed in a few particular cases, and it's additionally discussed. Anyways, it asks whether a slaughterer is allowed to make multiple incisions. Some say only one cut would be permitted, and it needs to be open and discernible. That's argued from a few cases. Anyways, if the man stuck the knife between pipes, he severed one and then removed the knife and then severed the other, it would be invalid. But if he stuck the knife under the skin and then severed both pipes, it would be valid. This shows that making the cut from above to below, even that is prohibited in this case. Some say if the knife is stuck under the skin and then severed both pipes, it's unresolved, and if the knife was first stuck under a bandage on the animal or under matted wool, that would be unresolved too. Also, if the pipes were mostly cut and then the knife was stuck under the skin and the remainder was severed, that would also be unresolved. New Mishnah. A major point that's prohibited in slaughter is pressing the knife down, so using force. Instead, it just needs to be a smooth back and forth motion. If somebody slaughters 2 animals simultaneously, that's valid. If 2 people hold a knife to slaughter one animal, even if the blade is lower than the handle, it's valid. If somebody cut off the animal's entire head by applying pressure, that slaughter would be invalid. If somebody cut off the animal's entire head in one stroke, if the knife is as wide as the entire neck, it would be valid. If somebody slaughtered 2 animals simultaneously and cut off both of their heads in one stroke, if the knife is as wide as one neck, it's valid. These only apply if there was only a forward stroke made, or only a reverse stroke made. If he made a forward and a reverse stroke and slaughtered the animal, even if the knife was tiny, as long as there was no pressing, it's valid. The Gemara brings sources for this concept that slaughtering with a pressing or chopping motion is prohibited. A case was brought, one of the sages slaughtered a flying bird by precisely shooting an arrow through its throat, which was valid as it was based on the feathers that it hadn't burrowed between the pipes, and they were able to cover the blood as the whole valley that the bird was flying in was pre-prepared. Anyways, we said it's valid to slaughter an animal by beheading it so long as the knife is as wide as the neck. Some say it actually must be double the width of the neck to be valid. Anyways, if a back and forth motion was made to slaughter the animal, we said the blade could be any size, although it really depends on the type of blade, as certain scalpels had improper protrusions, needles are forbidden as they just tear the pipes, and it's argued if an awl could be used. New Mishnah. If a knife just fell by itself and precisely slaughtered an animal, it's invalid as the verse specifically references a person slaughtering. The Gemara suggests based on this, if somebody throws a knife and it precisely slaughters an animal, it's valid, even though he didn't intend to. According to this opinion, intent by slaughter wouldn't be required. It debates if intent is required by other concepts. If a menstruating woman with nida impurity accidentally immerses in a mikveh without any intent, some say she's permitted to be with her husband afterwards, but she cannot eat teruma tithes. Some say she cannot be with her husband, and it debates between these. This is based on if intent is required while immersing in regards to mundane matters, such as cohabitation. Anyways, by slaughter, it's argued as to whether intent is required for the actual act of severing the animal's pipes, which doesn't exist by just throwing a knife and happening to slaughter an animal. Anyways, by the dispute by a menstruating woman who accidentally immerses herself, it's argued as to what the circumstances of this case are. Some say it's where the woman fell off a bridge into an immersion pool. Others say she immersed in water, but only to cool herself down. Anyways, if somebody intentionally simultaneously slaughtered a red heifer offering at the same time as a regular animal, it's agreed that only the red heifer is invalid. However, if somebody unintentionally slaughtered a regular animal along with a red heifer, it's a debate as to which is valid and which is not based on a verse. The same applies with cutting a vegetable alongside a red heifer, whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally. New Mishnah. The next point that's prohibited in slaughter is pausing in the middle of the act. If midway through slaughter the man drops his knife or adjusts his clothes, or he got tired midway through, or he stopped and somebody else picked up after him, in any of these cases, if the slaughterer pauses in the middle for the length of time it takes to slaughter, which will be defined, and then resumes, it's invalid. Others say it's for the amount of time it takes to examine. The Gemara disputes what this "as long as it takes to slaughter" means, whether it refers to a bird or an animal. Some say it goes by what he's currently slaughtering at the moment. Others say it's the time to slaughter an animal. Others say it's the time to go and press the animal to the ground and to slaughter it. Others say it's the time to lift up, lay down, and then slaughter the animal, which is dependent on the size of the animal currently being slaughtered. Related, if somebody's slaughtering with a dull knife, so the slaughter takes a very long time, so long as he never pauses, he's not in violation of this principle. If the man slaughtered a majority of the pipe and then paused, and then slaughtered the remainder, that would stand unresolved. According to the opinion that a pause is the time it takes to examine the knife, this is by the time it takes for an expert to conduct an examination. New Mishnah. If somebody severed the esophagus properly, but then tore the trachea with a nicked blade, or the trachea was torn and then the esophagus was properly severed, or he only slaughtered one pipe at all, or he properly cut one pipe and then impermissibly burrowed the knife to sever the other from the back, Some say this animal is invalid with the status of one that was improperly slaughtered. Others say it's invalid as one with the status that it has a defect. The first opinion held that generally if an animal becomes invalid through the course of the slaughter, it's treated as if it was slaughtered improperly, and if it was slaughtered properly and then due to another factor becomes invalid, it's treated like it has a defect. The second opinion conceded to the first. The Gemara debates as to who exactly authored this Mishnah based on individually held opinions. These principles are additionally debated based on some individual cases, and there's some further discussion on this new Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered a domesticated or undomesticated animal or a bird and no blood came out, they're still kosher. They can be eaten with unwashed hands, which are considered to be impure as they aren't susceptible to impurity due to the lack of moisture from the blood. Others say that they are susceptible to impurity through the act of slaughter. The Gemara proves that we're discussing typical animals, not temple offerings, as they're permissible in spite of the lack of blood, which would have actually been necessary by a temple offering. It gives several other proofs based on principles of the laws of impurity that apply between regular and sacrificial animals. It is disputed as to exactly what type and level of impurity the hands have in this case that they're permitted to eat the food with. There are a few interpretations of this, and these are additionally discussed regarding authorship of these principles. Anyways, it additionally goes through points on the laws of impurity and how they relate to here. These are additionally discussed, going through different levels of impurity and which ones create prohibitions of eating teruma, tithes, if consumed or touched, depending on the situation. Further sources for these principles are cited, along with some related points, and there's additional discussion on these laws of impurity. It goes through further of these opinions and also through a number of sources. New Mishnah. It's forbidden to slaughter an animal as it's dying out of concern that it'll die on its own and not from the actual act of slaughter. So, because of this, an animal needs to be showing signs of life as it's being slaughtered, such as by moving its limbs. If somebody slaughtered an animal that was about to die, some say it's only permitted if it's moving its foreleg and hind leg. Others say it's sufficient if it just spouts blood. Others say if somebody slaughtered a dying animal at night, and the next morning he finds the side to the throat around the incision full of blood, it would be kosher, as it spouted blood, in accordance with the former opinion. Still, others say the animal needs to be seen moving either a foreleg, a hind leg, or its tail. This applies to small animals and to large animals, although there's a difference. A small animal needs to extend and also retract its foreleg to be kosher, as otherwise it's just viewed as if it's spasming. Also, all of this only applies if the animal is about to die. If it's healthy, even if it's not moving, it's assumed to be kosher. The Gemara sources the principle that an animal about to die has this concern of non-kosher from verses. These are additionally discussed in regards to the definition of an animal being close to death. It's said to be one that doesn't rise when prompted to do so, even if it can still eat. Anyways, if the animal before it's slaughtered moves or uses the restroom or wiggles its ears, that's a debate if it's sufficient there. Some say it's sufficient if the animal's leg was already extended to bend it back if it does that. If further debates if moving or using the restroom or wiggling ears would be sufficient to prove that it's alive. Some say it would have to be a very strong moo or a powerful ejection of waste. Additionally, it's argued as to when this sign of movement must be done. Some say during the actual act of slaughter. Some say even at the beginning, it argues from sources. Others say it must be at the very end of slaughter, and there are further sources quoted. In the end, it's ruled by a small animal, it would need to either extend and retract its foreleg, or just extend or retract a hind leg. By a large animal, whether it's a hind or foreleg, it just needs to extend or retract one. By a bird, it's sufficient to flutter its wings or to wag its tail. This isn't redundant, as we hadn't mentioned this principle about the bird. New Mishnah. If a Jewish man slaughters an animal for an idol worshipper, it's valid. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, as he says there's always a concern the animal will then be used for idol worship. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, saying as intent won't invalidate the offering here, everything goes by the intent of the slaughterer, not by the owner of the animal. The Gemara says, the first opinion says we only assume an idol worshipper to want the animal for idol worship if he expressly says so. Rabbi Eliezer says we presume that's the case, and Rabbi Yossi says it wouldn't really matter either way, as he stated. Alternatively, it said that the cases where the idol worshipper expressly stated that he's using the animal for idol worship, and the first opinion says an owner's intent only matters by temple offerings. Rabbi Eliezer says it would be a concern here, and Rabbi Yossi says that it wouldn't even matter if this was done inside the temple with an actual offering. Somewhat related, if somebody slaughters an animal in the temple to throw its blood or burn its fats for an idol worshipper, it's a debate if the animal can be benefited from. The same debate exists by a chatas offering that was slaughtered properly, but with intent to throw the blood not for its own sake. It explains the necessity of both of these to be mentioned, and additionally debates between them. This is discussed further, debating from other similar cases of intent, such as by laws of divorce. It winds up holding the law in accordance with Rabbi Yossi that the owner's intent has no effect, so the slaughter would be entirely permissible. Sources are quoted. Besides for that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who held the idol worshipper's intent was a concern, if an idol worshipper gives a coin to a butcher for an animal that's about to be slaughtered, he'd rule that if the idol worshipper is a powerful man, the animal will just be forbidden, but if he's not, you can just tell him to leave you alone. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal with idolatrous intent that it should be for a mountain, a hill, a sea, a river, or a desert, it's invalid. If two people hold a knife and slaughter at the same time, and one has intent that it should be for an idol, and the other has valid intent, the offering would be invalid. The Gemara says, it implies that although this offering is invalid, it's not entirely prohibited for benefit. It would be forbidden for benefit if you slaughtered it for a guardian spirit of a mountain or similar. Also, if somebody's animal is in front of an idol, if somebody walks over to it and slaughters it for the idol, it becomes totally prohibited for benefit as an actual act was done with it. It's discussed further as some holds that a person cannot prohibit somebody else's object even through a significant act. This point is disputed further. New Mishnah. Out of concern of it resembling idolatry, it's prohibited to slaughter into a sea, into a river, or into a vessel, but it is allowed to slaughter into a pool of water or on a boat over a vessel. Slaughtering into a pit is forbidden, but making a pit to channel the blood flow of a slaughtered animal would be permitted, but only inside of somebody's house and not in a street. That's because that was a practice of the Sciatic heretics, so they tried to avoid doing such. The Gemara explains that slaughtering into a river is forbidden, as it looks like he's making an offering to a guardian spirit. Slaughtering into a pool was allowed, so long as it's murky, so that way people don't think he's slaughtering to his own reflection. Slaughtering into a pit is forbidden, as mentioned, so it's allowed to have a channel that'll lead into a pit in your own house. That way it won't resemble the heretical Sciatic practices and that source. New Mishnah. If an animal is slaughtered outside the temple with intent as a temple offering, whether an ola offering, a shlamim, an asham taloi, a paschal offering, or a toda offering, it's a debate if it's valid. If two people held a knife and one had intent that it should be for an offering and the other had valid intent, it would be invalid. However, if somebody had intent to slaughter an animal as a chatas, as a definite asham, as a bechor or a meiser tithe, or as a substitution offering, it would be valid. The general principle is that it's valid to slaughter an animal with intent if that type of offering could not be offered as a vow or a gift. The Gemara mentions that not every forbidden offering can be a vow or a gift offering. This follows the opinion that the Asham Taloi offering can be brought at any time, and the Paschal offering is that it can be designated at any time also, so there's issues with intent by those specifically. It's a debate if any of these issues apply by blemished offerings. Also, slaughtering an animal with intent as a chatas offering is only allowed if he didn't need to bring a chatas at that time, which he declared for. Also, slaughtering an animal with intent as a substitution is only allowed if he didn't have an offering in-house that can be substituted, which he declared for. The generalizations at the end teach that a Nazir's Ola is prohibited to have intent of, even if people didn't see him take a Nazirite vow, and also that intent for an Ola for a woman who had given birth is allowed, assuming the man is unmarried, so there's no concern that he had actually slaughtered the animal for an offering in this impermissible manner. If the man is married, it's prohibited, as there's a concern people might think that she miscarried, which is what he's declaring the offering for. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Chullin begins going through the laws of animal defects and kosher. The first Mishnah says, if an animal is found to have certain specific defects which are life-threatening, the animal is not kosher. These are a punctured esophagus, a severed trachea, a punctured brain membrane, a heart with a puncture that reaches into the actual chamber of the heart, a severed spinal cord, a totally removed liver, a punctured or deficient lung. Rabbi Shimon says the lung would need to be punctured through to the bronchi. Anyways, if the animal's fourth stomach, the abomasum, was punctured, it would not be kosher. If the gallbladder is punctured, if the intestines are punctured, if the first stomach, the rumen, is punctured, if the outer paunch, which will be defined later, is torn, then by these it would be invalid. Rabbi Yehuda says by a large animal, the tear would need to be a handbreadth, and by a small animal, it would need to be a majority. If the third stomach, the omesum, or the second stomach, the reticulum, are punctured to the outside, it's not kosher. The animal is also considered to have an invalidating defect if it fell off of a roof. If most of its ribs are broken, if it was clawed at by a wolf, Rabbi Yehuda says only small animals are invalidated if they're clawed by a wolf, and large animals need to be clawed by a lion. Small fowl are invalidated if they're clawed at by a sparrowhawk, and large fowl are invalidated if they're clawed at by a large hawk. Generally, if a slaughtered animal is found to have a defect which would have killed a living animal, it's invalid. The Gemara says, obviously the source for this whole concept is the verse, and meat that was torn in the field you shall not eat. It additionally debates the source for the principle that an animal with such a defect is said to be unable to live. Anyways, according to the opinion that there's a very specific amount of defects, as listed in our Mishnah 18, it brings yet another unlisted type of defect, an animal with hind legs severed above the lower knee joint. So this opinion holds that a wound like this could be cauterized and the animal will live, and it's specifically said to be kosher, which is why it wasn't included in our list of 18. So another type of defect, a deficiency in the spinal column, which is debated if it's 1 or 2 vertebrae that has issues. So this answer's fine, add it to the list, but there's still only 18 as it combines the categories of a puncture in the reticulum and omasum. Evidently they hold a flayed animal as still kosher, and by a shriveled lung it swaps that with a punctured gallbladder. However, besides for all of these, there are even more invalidating defects that are listed: a dislocated thigh bone, a diseased kidney, a punctured spleen, if majority of the trachea and esophagus are detached, a dislocated rib, a majority crushed skull, and a flawed abdominal wall. Fine. So this suggests to just combine all the 8 punctured organs from the Mishnah into one, and then add these 7, although you then have to combine 2 from these, which speak on punctured organs, and then you could add back in an animal with a severed leg or one that was flayed to equal 18. It said there are 8 traditional categories of invalidating defects in animals, which are punctures, severs, removals, deficiencies, claws, having fallen, and fractures. This excludes disease, which is held by one opinion by a kidney. It does additionally dispute if a punctured gallbladder would create an invalidation. Some say there would be no invalidation if the puncture occurred against the liver. It's also said that if the gizzard of a bird is punctured, but it doesn't go through all of the way through to the inner pouch, it's still kosher. This would also apply if the inner pouch was punctured, but not the outer layer. Similarly, by an animal's esophagus, which has 2 layers, a red and white one, it's only not kosher if both layers are fully punctured. It mentions the colors to say if the colors are reversed, the animal is not kosher. Now, if by a gizzard or an esophagus, if both layers are punctured but separately, in 2 different locations, it's said by the esophagus it's kosher, but by the gizzard it's not. Others say the opposite, as an esophagus expands and contracts, unlike a gizzard, which it cites supports for. Related, it said a scab on an esophagus is not considered to be a proper scab. Also, an esophagus is only subject to be examined for a red spot from the inside, which is relevant by an animal clawed by a predator, which it brings a case of. If a thorn was lodged into an animal's esophagus, it said it's fine as it probably healed. Others disagree, and it disputes this from a number of suggestions, asking how this differs from a few different cases. By the upper section of the esophagus, some say any puncture at all creates liability, as he holds that area is valid for slaughter. Others say only if majority is punctured, as he holds it's not permitted to slaughter there. It defines the parameters of this area, which there are a few opinions on. Anyways, it debates further as to what the permitted areas of slaughter by the esophagus are, and some define this from a hand span from the top down to the point where the inner lining of the digestive tract grows hair. It disputes where exactly this reaches until. It's also said, according to an opinion, if the entire upper part of the esophagus gets detached from the lower jaw, it's still permitted. Others ask, but the pipes are being uprooted, which is prohibited, and it's answered here, they're not being uprooted, they're being cut away, or according to those that allow it to be uprooted, it's where they were detached in a continuous line as opposed to what's prohibited, which is where they're uprooted intermittently. Anyways, we said a defect was if the trachea is severed. This is defined as majority. Some define this majority to be the full trachea, including its wall. Others say it's only majority of the hollow interior being severed. It argues this from some cases, quoting a number of verses on this topic. It also expounds a bit on how impressive and important it is to be able to examine and rule stringently by these laws of animal defects. It also mentions a few sages and how they would refuse to accept the gifts that they were offered. Anyways, if a portion of a trachea was riddled with a bunch of little tiny holes, it said the holes could combine to form a majority. Others dispute this. In the end, it rules that if the holes have a deficiency, they would invalidate the animal if they add up to the measurement of the size of an Isarin coin. And if they don't have a deficiency, they would invalidate the animal if they add up to the majority. As for by a bird, it's a bit more complicated. It said you should cut around the perforated area on 3 sides and then fold the perforated area down, and if it covers majority of the mouth of the trachea, it's invalid. If part of the trachea was found cut to make a little flap, it's invalid if the hole from this flap is large enough for an Isser coin to enter through. If a trachea was split down its length, if there's still one horizontal band of cartilage intact on both sides, then it's valid. Some say it's fine if any amount on both sides are intact. Some are of the opinion that the whole neck of an animal is valid for slaughter from the cricoid cartilage until the lobes of the lower lung where the trachea reaches into. I spent some time defining these. If at the exact moment of slaughter the animal stretched its neck so there's more of the trachea than usual in the neck area, that's unresolved. It clarifies some additional points. Anyways, we said the animal is invalid if its brain membrane is punctured. Some say it's enough for just the upper layer of membrane to be punctured. Others say it also needs to go through to the lower membrane. I spent some time defining the parameters of these and where exactly the brain extends until, which is within the cranium, at which point the spinal cord starts. We said if the heart is punctured through to its chamber, it's invalid. It argues which chamber this refers to, the larger or the smaller ventricle. That's disputed based on comparison to the lungs. Regarding the aorta, as it's encased in fat, which it defines, some say the animal is invalid there by the slightest puncture, some say only by majority. Anyways, it said that there are 3 pipes that branch off from the trachea. One goes to the heart, which is treated like the heart, one goes to the lungs, which is treated like the lungs, and one goes to the liver, which is treated like the liver, in regards to how much of a puncture is required. Others disagree and say the lung pipe is treated like the liver, and the liver pipe is treated like the lung. We said if the spinal cord was severed, the animal is not kosher. Some say this is in majority, others say even a puncture. It said we follow the former opinion. Some say majority is specifically of the meninges, others say it's majority of its nerve tissue, that's disputed on additionally, and it cites further invalidating factors by a spinal cord, such as if it's liquefied or softened or otherwise. If the spinal cord cannot stand on its own weight, that's unresolved. If the actual nerve tissue softened, that's when it's invalid. If it just lost substance, that's fine, although others dispute that. Anyways, it further disputes what constitutes an invalidating spinal injury as to where exactly on the spine the issue starts. By a bird is debated. Some say it's invalid if the spine is severed below the wings. Others say it's until between the wings. That's disputed. We said if the animal's liver is removed, it's invalid and not kosher. It said this implies if any of the liver remains at all, it's valid. Some say this means in all of its volume must remain. Others say any amount is fine. There are a few particular unresolved cases, like what if there's an all of its volume of the liver remaining, but it's spread out in several locations and similar. If the liver became loose, but it was still connected to the diaphragm, it's said to be fine, as it's entirely present. We said the animal is invalid if a lung was punctured. There's variation if this refers to the outer or inner membrane. Some say it's fine if the inner membrane isn't punctured, as it retains air. In the end, it's held that the outer membrane also protects the lungs from losing air. It's stated, if the lung is inflated and you hear air escaping, you place a feather on that spot, and if it flutters, the animal isn't kosher because there's a puncture. Otherwise, it's fine. If they're not sure where the hole exactly is, they would fill a basin with lukewarm water so that way the membrane won't shrink or stiffen. Then they would stick the lung inside and inflate it, and if bubbles appear, then the animal is not kosher, and otherwise it's fine. It's also said if the lung was peeled like a red date, it's kosher. And if it partially reddened, it's kosher. But if it entirely reddened, it's not. This latter point is disputed. If the lung partially dries up to the point that it crumbles if pressed with a fingernail, that's a defect and it's not kosher. It quotes as to who holds like this opinion. Also, a lung whose surface has scab-like spots, if they're black or multicolored, it's still kosher. Also, it said that punctured blisters on the lung don't count, it's still kosher. If 2 lobes of the lung adhere to one another, it's not kosher, assuming they don't lie naturally against each other. If they do, then it's fine. It's also said if there are 2 blisters on a lung right next to each other, that's an invalidating blemish. If there's 1 blister, but it's depressed in the middle so that way it looks like 2, then we puncture one of them, and if fluids flow between them, then it's just 1 blister, and the animal is kosher. If they don't, then it's invalid. Anyways, it's also said the animal lung has 5 types of lobes, 3 on the right and 2 on the left. If there's a missing, extra, or inverted lobe, the animal is not kosher. Others disagree and say an extra lung lobe isn't an invalidating defect. That's if the lobe is on the side. If it's between the 2 sides, then it's invalid. Incidents in this case are quoted. If the lung looks like a piece of wood, it's invalid. Some say this means visually, that it's bloated and white. Others say it means if it feels like wood, as it's hard. Others say it means it's smooth, but it's not divided into lobes. It's also said if the lung is light blue, it's kosher. If it's blackish colored, it's not kosher. If the lung is green or red, it's kosher, which is based on some related discussions. It's said if a lung is the color of the liver, then it's kosher, but if it has the color of regular meat, it's not kosher. If it's saffron or yellow colored, it's not kosher. If it's colored like a leek, it's fine. If part of the lung is clogged, it's cut open. If the clog was from pus, then it's still kosher. If not, we test it with a feather to see if wind could go through. If it does, it's kosher. If not, meaning it's totally blocked up, then it's not kosher. Also, a scab sealing the wound lung is not an effective seal, and it's still not kosher. If a lung makes a hissing noise when inflated, as mentioned, it's tested with a feather or hot water to identify if there's a hole. If a lung's insides have dissolved into a liquid, it's said to still be kosher, as this opinion holds an internal deficiency isn't considered to be a deficiency. Others dispute that. Some say it's only fine if the bronchi are intact, which it shows how to test for. Some just rule if the inside of a lung decayed, if the encasing membrane is intact, it's kosher, which it sources. If a lung is sticking to the chest cavity, it's fine. But if the lung is blistered around that area, it's a dispute if this means it was caused by a puncture, so it's said to take a thin knife and separate the lung from the wall, and to check where exactly the defect is. If it's on the chest, chest wall, then it's kosher, and if it's not, we assume it's on the lung, and it's not kosher. Some would check the lung for punctures in water, as mentioned. Others say this discussion existed with two non-adjacent lung lobes sticking to each other, although it said this doesn't make sense, as we said that we could separate the two, and if the defect is on the outer layer, it's fine, which would not apply by two lung lobes. That's discussed further. Some say if the lung is punctured and the meat of the chest wall seals it shut, it's still kosher. That's additionally discussed. If there's blisters on the lung, we said it's fine. This is unlike a kidney, where if there's a pus-filled blister, it's not kosher. A few related incidents are cited. Anyways, if a needle was found in an animal's lung, it's a debate if this is valid or not. This dispute is essentially as to how the needle got there. Some say it went through the vascular system, so it didn't necessarily puncture anything. Others say it went through the digestive tract, and it punctured its way through. Incidents of ruling on similar cases are quoted. For instance, there was a case where a needle was found in an animal's primary bronchial tube, and the sages didn't rule on it, as they held it was prohibited as it likely punctured through the digestive tract, but it was also in the primary bronchial tube, meaning it probably came through the vascular section. If there was a needle found in part of the liver, that's disputed. Some say it differs by the direction that the needle is facing. There are some other particular cases quoted. If a needle was found in the greater blood vessel of the liver, it's disputed. A date pit was found in an animal's gallbladder, and it was argued how it got there if it's invalidated as a defect. It also explains some points on the translation for the word lung. If the lung is found to be punctured in a place where the butcher poked around, it's a dispute, and it's ruled we assume that this was from the butcher's poking around, meaning it would be valid. Others disagree. Similarly, if a lung was found to be punctured by a parasite, it's a dispute if we say this happened before or after the slaughter. Anyways, we then said the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that a lung is only considered punctured if it goes through to the bronchi. Some say this refers to the primary bronchus. In the end, we don't hold like this opinion. Then we said there's invalidation if the abomasum was punctured. Some say the fat of this abomasum was allowed to be eaten by Kohanim by offerings. That's discussed further. It debates sources for this, and as to the exact extent of what's permitted in that area, it essentially is disputing as to whether the fat of this area is kosher or not. This is additionally relevant, as everybody says permitted fats conceal a puncture, but there's a dispute as to if forbidden fats in an animal conceal a puncture. It disputes this along with some related laws that are tangentially spoken on. It's said that helmet-shaped fats cannot seal a puncture. It's disputed as to where that refers to. Some say it's the fats in the rectum, others say it's the pericardium around the heart. Anyways, it further disputes as to if the fats of the abomasum conceal a puncture. Some say it depends on which fat, although it's unsure which is which. It argues this by very specific portions of the fat in this region. Related, it said that if the intestines are punctured, if the intestinal fluids seal the hole, it's still kosher. It discusses as to whether we hold like this opinion. Anyways, it's also said that we can compare punctures in the intestines to figure out when they were made. It also says that we can do this by the lung, even between rows, although not between different sizes. We can also compare holes in the trachea, even between bands and subbands on the trachea, but not from band to a subband and vice versa. If the rectum was punctured, it's still kosher as the hips surround and encase it. Some say it's invalid here only if a majority is severed, and if it's in an area where the hips don't surround it, it's invalid if it's torn in the slightest amount. Others say if there's a finger width section which is intact, it's still permitted. Then we said if the inner or outer paunch are torn, it's invalid. There's a lot of suggested definitions for this inner and outer paunch. Some say it's parts of the intestines, parts of the lower stomach, it's discussed. By these, we said according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's invalid if a handbreadth is torn by a large animal and majority by a smaller animal. Others explain it doesn't much matter between large or small animals. It's just that if the tear reaches either of these amounts, it's invalid. This is relevant particularly if a handbreadth is a bit more than majority. So he's saying if majority is torn by the animal, then it would still be invalid. It's also said if a circular hole the size of a selacoin was gouged out of an outer paunch, it's invalid, as if this circle was then unrolled, it would equal a handbreadth. Others say this only applies if it's larger than a selacoin. Anyways, then we said there is invalidation for puncturing the omasum or reticulum. If a needle was found sticking in the reticulum, if it's only sticking out of the inner wall, it's kosher. If it sticks through both walls, it's not kosher. If there's blood found on it, it's not kosher, as this definitely occurred before the slaughter. If there's no blood, it definitely happened afterwards, so it'd be fine. If a scab formed over the puncture wound, then we know the puncture was 3 days prior to the slaughter. If there is blood, but no scab, if the slaughterer wants a refund for this animal, the burden of proof that it was invalid when he purchased it is on himself. Additionally, this is unique that a puncture depends on if there's blood on the needle, as there's something that the blood can adhere to here. particular cases of this are discussed. We said an invalidating defect was the animal falling off of a roof. If somebody left his animal on a roof and finds it later on the ground, we don't assume it fell off of the roof. Cases are brought. For instance, an animal was seen with its legs dragging, and it was said it's fine, as we assume it was from a cramp and not from a severed spinal cord, as that's less common. Another ruling, if two rams butt into each other, there's said to be no concern of concussion unless they fall onto the ground afterwards. Similarly, if rams are stolen by thieves, if they're thrown over a wall, they're not considered to be damaged, as presumably they'll be thrown in a way that they won't get injured. If the thieves are returning the animal, we are concerned for them getting injured. This would not apply if they're being returned to repent. If an animal is struck with a stick down its length, there's no concern of this causing a defect, unless it was right in the middle of the spine. If the stick had knobs, or if it was struck widthwise, there would be a concern. A birth canal isn't considered to cause concussions in newborn animals, so there's no concern there. Ibrington discusses proofs for this concept. Also, when a butcher pushes an animal to the ground to slaughter it, that's not considered concern of causing a concussion. If the animal stood up right after falling, we don't need to wait the 24 hours to make sure it's not concussed. Checking the organs would be necessary, although if it walked right afterwards, it's a dispute. Stretching the foreleg is tantamount to standing up, and raising a hind leg is tantamount to walking here. Some say even stirring is like standing up. It's ruled, if an animal accidentally fell off of a roof and then just stood, there's no necessity to wait 24 hours, and if it walks, there's no need to examine its organs. If the animal's organs are being examined, it's a dispute as to where and how much. By a bird, if it fell into water, if it continues to swim, specifically upstream or in stagnant water, it's still valid. If it was downstream, but it was swimming faster than the flowing driftwood, it's valid. If the bird fell against a taut sheet, there is a concern of concussion. If it's not taut or it's folded, it's fine. If it flew into a net with close together knots, we're concerned for a concussion. If the knots are distanced, it's fine. If it fell into the top of bundled flax, there's a concern. If it hit the sides, it's fine. If it fell on bundles of reeds, there's a concern. If the bundle fell into beaten and combed flax, there is no concern. If it fell onto beaten flax that was bundled, if there's knots, there's a concern of a concussion. It discusses other particular substances. There's concern by sifted ash. There's no concern by unsifted ash. There's no concern by fine sand. There is a concern by coarse sand. There is a concern if it impacted against road dust. There's a concern if it impacted against a bale of hay, but not regular hay. There's a concern if it fell into wheat, but not barley. There are a few other examples. Point is, essentially, any substances that slip and slide when pressed against, it does not have concern of causing a concussion, and otherwise it would. If the bird impacts against glue on a board, if one wing is stuck, it's fine. If both wings are stuck, it's a debate as to whether it's able to lift itself back up. Others say they agree it's not allowed when both wings are stuck. And if one wing is stuck, it's a debate as to if it can fly with that one wing. The law is held, if both wings are stuck, it's not kosher. If one is, it's fine. Okay, we said a type of defect in an animal was most of its ribs being broken. This is defined as either 6 ribs on both sides, or 11 on one side and 1 on the other. These breaks must be by the midpoint towards the spine, at the upper half, and this only applies to larger ribs that contain marrow. It's a debate if the same amounts apply by dislocated ribs. It said if a rib is uprooted along with part of its vertebrae, it's a defect and it's not kosher. If 2 ribs on opposite ends of a vertebrae were dislocated, but the vertebrae is in its place, that's said to also be invalid, and it's discussed further as seemingly this case is a bit redundant to the prior, and that's additionally discussed. Anyways, there was an opinion that if the greater part of the skull of an animal was crushed, it's an invalidating defect. As for if this refers to most of the height or circumference, that's unresolved. Anyways, it was also said that if the flesh that covered most of the paunch is flawed in majority, that's invalid. Now it's asked, does this refer to it being torn or removed? It's discussed, and that's unresolved. By being clawed by animals, we clarified by animals, it's invalid if it's clawed by a wolf or a larger animal, and a bird is invalid if it's clawed by a sparrowhawk or larger. This is as this opinion holds that a smaller animal, like a cat, cannot make smaller animals, like sheep or goats, invalid. Some say that kids and lambs are invalid if they're clawed by a cat or similar, and a bird is invalid if it's clawed by a weasel. Some clarify this cat to be where somebody's trying to rescue it, which will make it really mad and claw extra harshly. This anger level of a cat, based on the case, would apply also if a hen escaped from it, although others disagree with this whole difference of the cat being upset. There's variation on this. This opinion says a weasel can cause a defect by clawing birds, a cat cannot cause a defect by clawing large sheep, and a cat can claw a kid or a lamb, but a weasel cannot. Anyways, besides for the sparrowhawk, it says that other non-kosher birds can damage birds. The sparrowhawk was specified as it can damage birds of its same size, while other birds can only damage things smaller than themselves. Others say that actually it can even damage things larger than itself, unlike by other birds. It said that a fox and also a dog do not have the ability to cause a defect by clawing. Also, it said that all of this about clawing applies to the foreleg and not to the hind legs. It also doesn't apply to teeth. It only apply there if there was intent and only if the predator clawed while it was alive. That last one's not redundant, as it's saying a paw that was cut off before it could retract, meaning that wouldn't invalidate the animal, as it said a predator only injects its poison after its claws are retracting from the animal. Also, if a lion walks over to a bunch of oxen and they later find a detached claw in one of the oxen, we're not concerned it was from that lion, as most lions don't lose claws while attacking animals, so it probably just got detached and lodged in there from somewhere else. Others say it could be the exact inverse, as it's unlikely that the claw could be embedded in an animal like that, so it probably got clawed, so that's unresolved. If, instead of a claw, the mark of a claw was left in the animal, we are concerned it was clawed. Also, the discussed point that animals' claws don't come out and get removed from the animal's paw is if they're not dry. If they are dry, or there are multiple claws in a row, we are concerned that it was attacked by the lion. Anyways, if there's an uncertainty if the animal was clawed, it's a debate if we assume if it was clawed or that it wasn't. If we're not sure if a dangerous animal entered an animal pen, we do assume it did. If we're not sure if clawing was done by a cat or a dog, we can just assume it was the dog. If a lion sat quietly among oxen, we can assume it didn't attack any of them. If the lion killed one of the oxen, we can assume that's all it did. If the lion and oxen are both heard making noise, we can assume that they didn't attack each other. The case of uncertainty is where the oxen are mooing and making noise and the lion itself is silent. So it further disputes as to who exactly we hold like by this case. There was a case brought, a duck was found with its neck stained with blood, and it was said that we can assume that was from a reed as opposed to a cat. Also, a clawed animal must be examined further for poisoning, along with similar points. If the neck is clawed opposite the trachea or esophagus, it's said to be invalid if the greater part of the pipes are detached. Some say a clawed animal is only invalidated if the clawed flesh reddened, and if it decayed, it's like it doesn't exist anymore. It further speaks on principles of examining this area. At the end, we set a general rule that an animal with a defect that will kill a living animal is invalidated by this defect. This is to include the 7 additional defects that were mentioned way back at the beginning. Some very precise hunters back then would kill animals by precisely striking their sciatic nerve or a kidney, which didn't cause a defect as that wasn't necessarily fatal. New Mishnah. The following defects in an animal do not invalidate them and they're still kosher. A punctured trachea, or if it's split down the middle, some say up to the size of an Italian Isar coin, can be missing and it'd still be valid. If the skull is diminished but the membrane isn't punctured, if the heart is punctured but not all the way into its cavity, if the spine was broken but the spinal cord was not severed, if there's still a remaining piece of the liver the size of an olive, if the omasum and reticulum are only punctured between each other, if the spleen was removed, if the kidney was removed, if the lower jaw was removed, if the uterus was removed, if it has a shriveled lung which was caused naturally, it would remain kosher. If it's flayed, Rabbi Meir says it's kosher and the sages would disagree. The Gemara says it's a debate whether the first Mishnah, which listed prohibited defects, and ours, which lists permitted ones, as to which is being stricter, specifically by the case of a dislocated thigh bone as to if that's a defect or not. That's discussed, although it does conclude if this is dislocated or even if its ligament is severed, it's still kosher. If the ligament decayed, it's not. We said an Italian Isser-sized piece of the trachea can be missing, and it'll still be kosher. If it defines this measurement, giving additional comparisons and references, it more specifically qualifies these measurements, and also says that all measurements, with one exception, should be treated stringently. We said if the animal's spleen was removed, it's still kosher. If it was punctured, that's a dispute, along with if it was cut. If the kidneys were removed, we said it's kosher. It would not be kosher if one of those kidneys were diseased. If a kidney was punctured, if it was in the thin part, it's fine. If it was in the thick part, it's not kosher unless a dinar's coin's thickness remains intact. It said that any invalidating defect in a lung is fine by a kidney. As we know, a puncture in a lung is problematic. While it's apparently fine by a kidney, it actually ends up rejecting this comparison as they're just very different organs. For instance, pus in a lung is still kosher, while in a kidney, if it's cloudy or fetid, it's not kosher. If a kidney shriveled and shrunk by a small animal, the minimum size that it's fine still is of a bean, and by a larger animal, it's of a medium-sized grape. We said an animal is kosher if its jaw is removed. This would only apply if the animal can still be kept alive by feeding it. It additionally defines several of the remaining defects. It said that the opinion which said a flayed animal is still kosher wound up retracting his view. Some said if there's still a piece of skin remaining on the animal the width of a sella coin, it's valid, if it runs down the length of the spine specifically. Others say a piece of skin this big must be on all of the body's joints, and others say it must be at the navel specifically. If all of the skin was intact besides for those listed areas, that's unresolved. There's a dispute feet of skin by the hooves would be sufficient to keep a skinned animal valid. It discusses this and seems to prove that it would be. New Mishnah. Now for birds. The following are considered defects in fowl. A punctured esophagus, a severed trachea, if a weasel bit its head where it'll cause a defect, if the gizzard was punctured, if the intestines were punctured, if it fell into a fire and its organs were burnt, or if they turned green, they'd be not kosher. If they turned red, it's fine. If somebody stepped on the animal or crushed it against a wall, or if an animal crushed it, if it flutters around and stays alive for 24 hours, would still be kosher. The Gemara says, by the case of a weasel biting its head, you need to test it by sticking a finger into its mouth and pressing up to see if any brain matter leaks out. If the upper membrane was punctured, then presumably the lower one would also rupture. Others disagree and say a weasel's teeth are thin and curved, so it's impossible to check if there's a defect. This was retracted, and it's a debate if you can check the puncture with a nail. It sources these opinions. A number of particular incidents on this are listed. Regarding the animal falling into a fire and their organs being damaged to the point that they changed color, it said that this is similar to a puncture, and that they're not kosher if this occurs in the slightest amount. If the liver turns green in an area next to the intestines, it's said to not be kosher. Incidents are quoted. It said that if a red organ turns green, it's no longer kosher. If a green organ turns red due to a fire, they're said to also not be kosher. If the red organs turn green from a fire and they're boiled and turn back red, they're said to be kosher, as they only had changed color due to the smoke. If there's no changes of color to the organs and they're boiled and turned green, they're said to not be kosher. It wouldn't be necessary to check this, as we don't assume there was a disqualifying defect. If the bird was trampled on, we said we wait 24 hours and then slaughter it. Nevertheless, it still needs to be additionally examined for defects. New Mishnah. The following are not considered defects in a bird, and it would still be kosher. A punctured trachea, or if it was split down its length, if a weasel bit it where it would not cause a defect. If the crop was punctured, some say even if the crop was removed, if the intestines come out but are intact, if the wings were broken, if the legs are broken, if its feathers are plucked, the bird would still be kosher. Some say it wouldn't be kosher if the down was removed. The Gemara quotes a case where they ruled on the removal of the bird's uterus, but it's unsure if it's ruled if it's valid or invalid. The roof of the crop has the same status as the esophagus, so that would be invalid through a puncture right there. We said if the intestines come out, if they're intact, it's still kosher. If they're stuffed back in, but backwards, it's no longer kosher. Incidents on this are quoted. It said by an animal, a dislocation of the foreleg is fine, but it's not kosher if the thigh bone is dislocated. By a bird, a dislocation of the thigh bone makes it not kosher, as would a dislocation of the wing, out of concern that the lung was punctured due to this. Others disagree and say you should just examine the lung. In fact, there's a debate if a bird's lung can even be damaged through falling or burning, as its ribs would protect it. It said a dislocation of a bird's thigh bone makes it not kosher. That is regional dependent, and it gives examples. Some say it's different if that area is severed. It additionally debates from many other discussions as to whether a dislocated thigh bone constitutes an invalidating defect. It said the accepted law is that this would make the bird not kosher. It said one sage would run experiments, and he took a hen that had its down removed and he put it inside of a warm oven while wrapped in a mat, and it regrew new, thicker down, proving that if a bird loses its down, it's not necessarily fatal. It gives other examples of experiments that he ran on the behavior of ant colonies and similar. Some say that the way to prove an animal does not have an invalidating defect is if it can survive for 12 months. That's actually disputed, as others say it's 30 days and others say it's several years. It's ruled that an animal with a defect could still be able to have children and improve physically. Some say if a hen has a defect, its first clutch of eggs are invalid, but afterwards they're fine. It additionally debates between these, largely based on whether the eggs are considered to be part of the bird's body. In the end, it holds the law is that a male that possibly has a defect, if it survives for 12 months, it's fine. If it's a female, if it can have children, it's fine. It's also said, somewhat related, that any creature that has no bones, so insects or a worm or similar, cannot survive for 12 months. Based on this, a wormy vegetable would be allowed to be eaten after 12 months. It's also said that there's no such thing as a day-old gnat or a year-old fly. It said in later tractates that an animal with 3 or 5 legs is considered to be a blemish, but not a defect. This would apply by a foreleg, but if it's a hind leg, it's also a defect, as an excess limb has the same law as if it were missing. It gives a number of examples of these. If 2 intestines come out of 2 separate points of the abomasum, some say they're kosher if they connect to a single tube. Others say they're kosher even if they don't. The opinion which said that the removal of a bird's down makes it a defect is as he holds it's part of the actual skin. Others dispute this. New Mishnah, some unique types of defects in animal suddenly has an increase in blood, if it inhaled smoke, if it was overcome with cold, if it ate oleander, if it ate chicken feces, or if it drank bad water. In all of these cases, it's still kosher. If the animal ate poison, or if a poisonous snake bit it, it's not an invalidating defect, but it's prohibited to eat for safety reasons. The Gemara says, some hold that if an animal ate asafoetida, it's invalidated, as it could puncture its digestive tract. Another source disagrees, saying it's perfectly fine, although that's explained to be referring to the leaves, which are not dangerous, unlike the actual grains, which are. It also says meat bitten by a poisonous animal is fine, unlike our Mishnah, as that's talking about poison that's dangerous for animals, not people, unlike our Mishnah, which talks about poison that's dangerous for people. It also says that if an animal eats a root of aconite, it's fine. It says eating a ton of asafoetida is bad for you, and it also describes other foods that are unhealthy to be eaten in large quantities. New Mishnah. Okay, now on what defines an animal as kosher. The kosher signs of wild or domesticated animals are stated biblically here, that an animal is kosher if it has split hooves and if it chews its cud. The kosher signs of birds, however, are not stated in scripture. It just gives a list of permitted and forbidden birds. So the sages say that the forbidden types of birds are those that have claws, while a kosher bird is one that has an added toe in the back, a crop, and a peelable gizzard. Rabbi Eliezer says if a bird which stands on a branch puts 2 different claws on either side, that means it's not kosher. As for grasshoppers, there are uniquely some species that are actually kosher. Any type that has 4 walking legs, 4 wings, and 2 jumping legs, and its wings cover a majority of its body, that would be kosher. Rabbi Yossi says it specifically needs to be the chagav type locust. As for fish, it's kosher if it has fins and scales, which it defines. Rabbi Yehuda says that it must have at least 2 scales and 1 fin. The Gemara says, on the kosher signs of an animal, that it has split hooves and chews its cud, the fact that it has no upper front teeth, like these, means it definitely chews its cud, and that means it's kosher. A camel isn't kosher, for example, as it has upper front canines here. This is useful, for example, if the animal's hooves are severed and you need another way to check. The only exception is a young camel, which doesn't have upper front teeth, but it's not kosher anyways. So if you're sure it's not a young camel, you can check by its front teeth. Similarly, if you find an animal that has messed up teeth, so you can't check from its mouth, you can just check its hooves, so long as you're sure it's not a pig, which uniquely has split hooves, but it's anyways not kosher as it doesn't chew its cud. Also, if you find an animal with messed up teeth and hooves, you can examine its muscle to see if it's kosher, as it would be kosher if the muscle of the flanks of the tail run both lengthwise and crosswise, with the exception of the wild donkey, which has this but is nevertheless not kosher. Additionally, the Mishnah specified a difference between wild and domesticated animals, which is relevant for some laws of forbidden fats. If an animal is a wild animal, meaning it has horns and split hooves, it's said to have its fats be permitted. This specifically refers to horns which are branched, like by a deer, and if they're not branched, then they have to be layered, rounded, and grooved with merged close together grooves to be a wild animal with permitted fats. This would exclude animals like oxen and goats. It debates the status of a specific unique species of goat. It also speaks on a number of verses, and it mentions the time that a Roman Caesar spoke to one of the sages, and he asked how God is compared to a lion, if people can kill lions, and the sage answered, he's actually compared to the lion of Ben Eli, which the sage prayed to have appear, and it did, and the lion roared so loudly that it caused women to miscarry and the walls of Rome to collapse and people to have their teeth fall out and the Caesar to fall off of his throne. And it mentions a few other similar stories between the sages and the Caesars. It also defines an ox as being broad and broadly hooved with a large head and tail, and the opposite applies by a donkey, which is relevant by some laws of sales. It also speaks on the offering Adam made to God, which was said to be a great ox with a single horn. It speaks a bit on verses regarding the creation of the world. It also speaks on the creation of the sun and the moon, and how the moon was upset that it was smaller. So it's said that the he-goat of the Rosh Chodesh offering is atonement for that. There are further points. Additional verses are expanded on regarding a number of topics and the important things we can learn from them. Regarding the kosher signs by birds, it does clarify that they're referenced in scripture by the listed animals, but the actual listed signs were derived through inference. The bird that is referenced in scripture as non-kosher is a nesher, which is probably an eagle. Some say based on this, as an eagle has no kosher signs at all. If a bird has even one kosher sign, it's fine. Others disagree based on the other specified birds in scripture as non-kosher. It interesting to base this principle from other sources. Essentially, there are 24 types of birds in scripture that are specified as non-kosher, and as mentioned, there are 4 signs of kosher. Many of the birds have 3 kosher signs, which are specified. Some of the birds have only 2 kosher signs, but the eagle has no kosher signs at all. And as that last one was chosen to be specified in scripture, it essentially shows that Even a single kosher sign is sufficient to make a bird kosher. Some say it goes by which specific types of birds the man can recognize. Others say it doesn't matter if the person is or is not an expert in identifying birds. What matters is if the bird has one characteristic of being kosher and it doesn't have claws. It speaks a bit more on specific birds being used for the Mitzvah leper purifications. There are further points on this, and it also gives an expanded list of birds, 8 of them with a questionable status as their gizzard can be peeled, but only with a knife. Issue is, we're not really certain of the translations for most of these birds. One of them is probably a swamp rooster, among others. I spent some time defining the birds listed in scripture as forbidden. One of them is the cormorant. There's also the hoopoe that's mentioned and sourced. It lists some other untranslated birds that are allowed. It says some depend on the region as to if they're commonly eaten there or not. There's another bird that's said to not be kosher. Some translate it as the owl, some say it's a bat, and it's said to have an equivalent in the forbidden impure Shiratzim creatures, which some say is a mole. It identifies some other birds that are non-kosher from scripture, the racham, which is the magpie, and that's defined, the oirev, the crow, the nates, the shrike, the stork, and the heron, and others. Some say there are a total of 24 types of non-kosher birds, although it disputes the total amount based on verses. It's largely a dispute as to if certain words or types of birds refer to the same variant, or otherwise, mainly by the birds the da'a and the ra'ah, and the aya and the daya, if those are the same or not. This is additionally discussed from a number of sources and on the specific types of birds encompassed in these lists. Anyways, it said the reason that the Torah lists the kosher animals that are permitted is as there are many more non-kosher animals than there are kosher animals, while the reason that non-kosher birds are listed is as there are many more birds that are kosher. This shows that teachings should be made in a concise manner. Anyways, a kosher bird can be eaten just based on a tradition if it's kosher, assuming that if one's hunting teacher that taught this was an expert. Anyways, if somebody buys eggs from a non-Jewish person, if he says they're from a kosher bird, then this person is believed. This is additionally clarified to be where the eggs are cut open, so you can't just tell what bird they're from based on the shell. However, others say that the signs of kosher eggshells isn't a biblical concept, so it requires the man's specification that the eggs are kosher. Purchasing pre-beaten eggs is definitely not allowed. There are some signs that an egg is not kosher, such as if both ends are rounded or if both ends are tapered, or certain issues with the yolk, but this isn't very reliable as there are exceptions. If the egg yolk has no albumin, such as from a reptile, it's said to be presumably from a sheretz creature and impermissible. This is relevant regarding prohibitions against eating it. Some related laws of eggs, it said there's no concern of absorption into kosher eggs if they're boiled together alongside non-kosher eggs, as they don't really exude a taste. Unfertilized eggs are allowed, and if there's a spot of blood in an egg, as blood cannot be eaten, the blood can be removed and the rest of the egg is fine. This only applies if the blood spot is inside the actual yolk. Some say it's only if the blood spot is in the albumin. It also sources the fact that eggs from non-kosher birds are impermissible. Anyways, we said a bird is not kosher if it has claws, and definitely if it claws and eats. If it has an extra toe in the back, a crop, and a peelable gizzard, it's kosher, and some add if it stands on a branch with 2 claws in each direction, it's not kosher, but if it has 3 claws forward and 1 claw back, it's possibly kosher. Some say that simply any bird that hunts other birds out of the air and eats them midair is not kosher. It also further defines what makes a grasshopper kosher, and the opinions and sources on that. It gives examples from a number of different specific species and types of grasshoppers. It spends a while defining this specific type of chagav grasshopper that we said is uniquely kosher, and it disputes as to whether a long-headed grasshopper is kosher so long as it has the listed necessary characteristics. That specific type of grasshopper is additionally disputed along with further points. Anyways, regarding fish, we said it needs to have fins and scales. If a fish currently doesn't have those when it's young, but it'll later grow these fins and scales, it's kosher. It gives examples of these from a few fish. It said if a fish has scales, it definitely has fins, but not necessarily vice versa. It discusses this in a number of verses. It's also said that eating a fish without a fin or a scale makes you transgress both a positive and a negative commandment based on some listed verses, and it disputes if small water sheretz creatures that germinate in vessels can be eaten, like little water bugs or similar. Some say you can, based on the implication of verses. It additionally discusses these, and it says the implication is that they're only prohibited if they're from actual seas and streams, but not from other bodies of water. It said that these creatures would be allowed if they're in a vessel of other liquids, like beer. The walls of the vessel by these creatures is considered like its natural habitat, which its sources related. It said that a cucumber that becomes wormy while it's attached to the ground is forbidden by the same principle of forbidden sheretz bug creatures, which its sources, but others disagree and say this would apply by bugs that develop in actual trees, not by produce. It is, however, agreed that insects that germinate in detached produce are allowed, although they're forbidden once they leave the produce and crawl on the ground. If a worm germinated in a detached fruit and then left and then immediately died, while it's partially on the ground or before it reaches the ground, that would stand unresolved. Similarly, if a worm germinated inside of a date and went out through the roof, or it was crawling towards the roof, or it went to an adjacent date without coming to the surface, that's unresolved. Parasite worms in animals are not kosher as they come from outside the animal. Others say they're fine, as they seem to think that parasites come from the animal itself, although in the end it rules that they're prohibited, as animal parasites actually enter from the outside through the nostril while they're sleeping, so they're forbidden. Larva in meat is not kosher, but it's fine if it's in fish. It describes how this was eaten and also sources this point. There are further points, and it ends by saying that the Leviathan is referenced as having both fins and scales, so that would actually be kosher. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Chullin covers the laws of animal fetuses in regards to the laws of slaughter. The first Mishnah says, if an animal is slaughtered and a fetus was found inside, whether it's dead or alive, the fetus is kosher, as it's considered to have been slaughtered with the mother. If the animal had a difficult labor, and the fetus kept sticking its leg out and pulling it back in, and the animal was slaughtered, the fetus would still be kosher. If the fetus stuck its head out, however, even if it drew it back in, it's as if it was born, and it's a separate entity, meaning it would require its own slaughter. If somebody cut off part of a fetus inside an animal's womb, and the mother is then slaughtered, the detached parts inside are still kosher. However, if somebody detaches part of the mother's actual spleen or kidney and then slaughters the animal, the detached parts are not kosher. The general rule is that if detached parts that are part of the actual animal are found inside, they're not kosher. But if they're not part of the actual animal's body, such as a fetus, they would be kosher. The Gemara says, whether the fetus's limb being stuck in and out of the animal, the fetus would be kosher, but the actual limb that was being stuck out wouldn't be. It debates the source for this. Another source seems to imply that that's not true, that the limb would still be kosher, but we dispute if that's referring to the actual limb as kosher, or to the rest of the fetus as permissible, which is what we stated here. Some derive that it would be permitted to eat the place of severance here, and also derive that an animal fetus of a cow that has joined hooves, which as mentioned in the prior chapter isn't kosher, an animal needs split hooves, but if such an animal was still a fetus and hasn't yet been born and it's still inside of the animal, it would still be kosher. Some disagree very simply and just state that the fetus's limb that went back and forth out of the animal would be kosher, basing it on the interpretation of a verse. It is, however, refuted. Some say the dispute is on if a limb is prohibited once it leaves its bounds. Others interpret the dispute as being if there's birth for individual limbs. The practical difference between the two is if majority of the limb leaves the womb, only according to the latter version, the rest of the limb that's still inside would be prohibited. Now, according to the opinion that there's no birth for individual limbs, it asks, what if a fetus sticks out each of its limbs individually, so it's majority born, but only a little bit at a time? Or by the same principle, what if individual limbs are stuck out and each one is severed one after the other? It tries to prove either way, but that stands unresolved. Or it's asked, what if a fetus sticks a leg out while it's inside the temple courtyard? As the courtyard wall is considered a boundary for slaughtering offerings, perhaps it could also be a boundary for the birth of a fetus to make them permissible. That's rejected, as technically the walls of the city of Jerusalem are themselves a boundary for the consumption of certain offerings, and those wouldn't do anything here. If a fetus sticks out a leg during the actual act of slaughter, right between the severing of the trachea and the esophagus, it's said that as the two severings are combined for the animal, they'll also combine for the fetus. Okay, what if a fetus stuck out its limb before slaughter and was then later removed totally alive, and it grew up and had its own child, as it's explained, with another unborn extracted fetus that grew up? It's asked if that child's corresponding limb would be problematic or not. Alternatively, some suggest the question to be where the extracted grown-up fetus has milk, if that milk is then kosher. This whole case stands unresolved. We said if a fetus has a part cut off inside the animal, the detached part is still kosher. That's sourced and discussed further. There are actually disputing opinions on where this is sourced from. New Mishnah. If an animal is struggling to deliver its first child, it would be permissible to cut out parts of the fetus as they emerge. And it's not considered to be a firstborn animal for the firstborn animal tithe, so it could still be benefited from by feeding it to dogs, for example. If the majority of the fetus emerged whole and was then cut apart, it must be buried, and the future children born by the mother animal are not firstborns. The Gemara says if a third of a firstborn fetus came out of an animal and it was sold to a non-Jewish person, and then another third came out, it's a dispute if it's sanctified to the temple as a firstborn. Some say it is, as it's sanctified retroactively once majority emerges. Others disagree and say that the sale stands as valid. Similarly, if a fetus came out a third through the abdominal wall and a third through the womb, the same dispute exists as to if this is sanctified as a firstborn animal tithe. Both of these are mentioned, as by the first case, the retroactive sanctification creates a leniency, but here this principle would create astringency. Others dispute the point from our Mishnah. They're discussed. If exactly half of a fetus emerges, but with majority of one limb, it's a debate if the rest of the limb has the same status as the majority. If the fetus was wrapped in plant fibers or garments, or it was in a different animal's amniotic sac, and the fetus emerged feet first, or if a weasel stuck its mouth into an animal's womb and swallowed and extracted a fetus and then spat it out back into the womb, or if an animal gave birth to a fetus into a different animal's womb and the fetus passed between wombs, all of those cases go unresolved. If the fetus was born without ever touching the walls of the birth canal, because they were stretched so wide, for example, it's asked, is it the airspace or the actual walls of the birth canal that sanctify an animal as a firstborn? So it would also be a question if the walls of the birth canal peel off and touch the fetus in an unusual manner, such as by coiling around its neck, or similar questions. It is, however, stated that if the walls of the birth canal are entirely stripped away, the fetus is definitely not sanctified as a firstborn. New Mishnah. If an animal's fetus died inside its womb and the shepherd came over and stuck his hand inside to touch it, the shepherd is still pure. Others say he's impure if the animal was impure. The Gemara explains the debate between sources for this conversation. A number of verses are expounded on, and these are discussed further. New Mishnah. If a human woman's fetus dies inside of her womb and the midwife touches it, the midwife is impure for 7 days for having touched the corpse, while the mother is only impure once the fetus comes out. The Gemara says, similarly, an impure object that's swallowed doesn't transmit impurity towards other objects, and a pure object that's swallowed doesn't acquire impurity from other objects. That's sourced. It also sources the fact that the same principle applies if the object wasn't swallowed, but was instead inserted into the body via the rectum. Further sources are quoted that this also applies to animals and similar. These principles that swallowed objects do not transmit or acquire impurity was actually stated elsewhere, so this isn't redundant, as it's actually telling us that if somebody, for instance, swallowed 2 rings, one that was pure and one that was impure, they don't contaminate impurity to each other. Anyways, our Mishnah seemingly contradicts this, as we said a fetus contaminates the midwife, but that's said to be different, as that's only a rabbinically instituted contamination of impurity, meaning this would apply even if somebody held that the dead fetus in the womb was pure. This was instituted so if the dead fetus's head pokes out of the birth canal, no one's going to touch it and then become impure. As for the woman giving birth, she'll be aware as to when the fetus is fully born. There's just concern she won't tell the midwife, as she'll be very preoccupied with giving birth. It argues further on the sources regarding certain verses. New Mishnah. If an animal had a difficult labor, and the fetus stuck out a leg, and it was severed, and the mother was then slaughtered, the remaining flesh of the fetus is pure. If the mother was slaughtered, and then the foreleg was slaughtered, it's impure by contacting an improperly slaughtered animal. Others disagree and say it's impure by contact with a slaughtered animal with a defect. These are 2 variations in laws of impurity. It explains this debate, and also sources the principle that slaughtering an animal with a defect thereby makes it pure. It is said that if an 8-month-old fetus is born alive, its slaughter does not purify it, as it has no variant that's fit for slaughter. The Gemara asks, why in the Mishnah's case should there be impurity, as it's in a concealed area? It suggested possibly that the limb gives impurity in the moment that it's severed, once it's detached, but it's still touching the rest of the body. Alternatively, it's that as it stands to be severed, it's as if it is. These are additionally discussed. It also says it's a rabbinic principle that an animal with a defect that is slaughtered, if it's consecrated to the temple, then it would transmit impurity. There are further disputes between the listed opinions as to how this animal is rendered impure. Additionally, there's a debate regarding a limb dangling from an animal, as it's mostly detached as to why it's impure, and therefore if slaughter could purify it. The variation is as a dangling limb is still part of the animal's body, unlike by a protruding fetus limb, which is separate. Related, it's said that an animal dying in a way other than slaughter affects legal detachment of the limbs, specifically by the dangling limbs of the animal. This is said to not apply by proper slaughter. It additionally clarifies these laws of impurity, and quotes for the sources for all of this. There was a dispute as to if a fetus's limb is protruding from an animal when it's slaughtered, if it maintains its impurity. This applies to a live fetus. By a dead fetus, it's a debate further if either they agree it's still impure or that it's still a dispute. It clarifies the exception by the 8-month-old fetus. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal and finds an 8-month-old fetus inside or a dead 9-month-old fetus, it's kosher without being slaughtered, although its blood must be removed first, as blood is forbidden to be eaten. If there was a live 9-month-old fetus inside, according to Rabbi Meir, it must be slaughtered to be eaten, and it cannot be slaughtered on the same day as its parent, which is a later discussed principle. While the sages say its mother's slaughter was sufficient to cover this. Some say even if the fetus then grows to be several years old and can plow a field, for example, its mother's slaughter still covers it, and it can be killed and eaten without proper slaughter. If somebody did not slaughter an animal and just opened it up and found a 9-month-old fetus inside, it must be slaughtered properly, as its mother wasn't. The Gemara clarifies, this leniency by animal fetuses only applies to slaughter. By other laws, like prohibitions against bestiality or plowing with it and other forbidden mixtures of animals, this would still be forbidden just like by all other animals of all other ages. Some actually allow the forbidden fats of an animal fetus as kosher and would also allow the blood. Others say both of these are not allowed. It's discussed between these. Also, if a firstborn donkey fetus is fully developed, according to the opinion that the slaughter of its mother purifies it so it doesn't need slaughter anymore, it argues if it can then be redeemed for the firstborn tithe. There's also dispute regarding its contamination of types of impurity and similar. These are additionally discussed. For instance, if a fish developed invalidating defects, it's unresolved if that is susceptible to types of impurity. If an animal miscarried, the status of the fetus's fats regarding impurity is also a debate. There's also a dispute if somebody slaughters an animal with a defect and then finds a live 9-month-old fetus inside, as to whether that's kosher based on the status of its mother. This is additionally disputed, along with the remaining points. Some say the ending rule is that a fully developed live fetus is considered slaughtered, as are its offspring and their offspring forever. Others disagree with this. It's discussed further. New Mishnah. Some defects by the hind legs. If the hind legs are severed below the joint, they're still kosher. If they're severed above the joint, it's a defect and it's not kosher. If the junction of sinews was removed, it's not kosher. If the bone was fractured and the skin is pierced, if majority of the flesh remains, the slaughter purifies the limb to be eaten, otherwise it does not. The Gemara disputes which joint exactly we're discussing here. Some say it's the lower tarsus joint, others say it's the upper joint, the patella. It additionally disputes between these opinions based on the later cases of the sinews being severed. There is also a debate as to where this junction of sinews is. It's by the tarsus joint, but there are three opinions. One says it's just above the bone, others say it's across it, and one says it's just below it. It's also disputed as to exactly how far up this extends. It's said to go up 4 finger breadths by an ox, and by a sheep or a goat, it's where they protrude, and where they're hard and thick, and where they're white. Others say it's even where they're pale. Anyways, there are 3 of these sinew strands, a thick one and 2 thin ones. If the thick one is severed, that's a defect, as it's most of the structural majority, and it's not kosher. And if the 2 thin ones are severed, then that's a defect, as the numeric majority is lost. Others say it's the exact opposite. If just the thick one is cut, it's fine, as it still has the numeric majority, and if just the thin ones are cut, it's fine, as it still has the structural majority. By birds, it said there are 16 strands of sinew in the junction, and if any of them are severed, that's a defect. Some say it's enough by an animal for the greater part of the sinews to be severed to create an invalidating defect. Others say it needs to be the greater part of each of the sinews. It clarifies the location of the bone fracture, creating a defect, and related. It's said, we rule that if the animal has a compound fracture on its leg above the tarsus, and the greater part of the bone is not covering the flesh, it's an invalidating defect. It's added that the limb would also transmit impurity through carrying it, but others dispute this. This case is further defined, and it's also said that skin here is equivalent to flesh. These parameters are defined further, and it brings some additional specific cases of bone breakages and fractures. For instance, if skin is scraped away in a ring around the area of a fracture, it's said, as the flesh will regenerate if the bone takes hold of it, it's still valid. New Mishnah, if somebody slaughters an animal and finds an amniotic sac inside, if somebody wants to eat that and he doesn't find it gross, he's allowed to eat it. It normally does not contract impurities of several variants, but if somebody plans on eating it, it would contract impurity as a food. If an amniotic sac partially emerges, it cannot be eaten as it had a fetus. If an animal with its firstborn fetus miscarries an amniotic sac, it can be given to the dogs to be eaten without concern for the firstborn tithe. If this happened with an animal consecrated as an offering, the sac should be buried. This should not be done by a fork in the road, and it should not be hung in a tree, as that was something done for superstitious reasons by the ancient Amorites, which shouldn't be emulated. The Gemara brings sources for all this. If a donkey hide was cooked extensively, it disputes if it has impurity as a food, which is unresolved. If just the amniotic sac came partially out of the womb, if it actually has a fetus, it's a dispute if we can assume that that's the actual sac's fetus, and if it's then permitted. It's said that there would be variation here. The reason a miscarried firstborn amniotic sac is not subject to the firstborn tithe is as it's a minority case, and we don't know what type it is, so it's not offered. If the mother was an offering, the sac is buried as it was fit to be consecrated from birth. We said we can't do superstitious ancient practices with an amniotic sac. It said it should be fine if it's being used for therapeutic reasons, and it gives examples, along with some practices that were done, like painting a tree with red pigment to alert neighbors that somebody was sick, so that way they'll pray on his behalf, which is a good thing to do. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Chullin continues covering the laws of slaughter, now on the principle against slaughtering certain animals on the same day. The first Mishnah says, as the verse states, an ox or a seh, it and its offspring you shall not slaughter on one day. It's forbidden to slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. This principle applies both inside and outside of Jerusalem, both when the temple does and does not exist, and to both consecrated and unconsecrated animals. So there are essentially 12 possible cases. If an unconsecrated animal and its unconsecrated offspring were slaughtered on the same day outside the temple, they can both be eaten, and there's 40 lashes for doing this. If both animals are consecrated and they're slaughtered outside the temple, the first slaughter receives kares, divine punishment. Both animals are prohibited to be benefited from, and there's 40 lashes for both. If both animals are unconsecrated and they're slaughtered inside the temple courtyard, they're both unfit, and there's 40 lashes for the second slaughter. If both animals are consecrated and they're slaughtered inside the temple, the first animal is a proper offering, and the second animal is unfit, and there's 40 lashes. If the first animal is unconsecrated and the second is consecrated, and they're both slaughtered outside the temple, the first animal is fine and valid, and the second is invalid, and there's 40 lashes. If the first animal is consecrated and the second is unconsecrated, and they're both slaughtered outside the temple, the first animal is invalid, and there's a penalty of kares, and the second is valid, and there's 40 lashes for both. If the first animal is unconsecrated and the second is consecrated, and they're both slaughtered inside the temple, they're both invalid, and there's 40 lashes for the second one. If the first animal is consecrated and the second is unconsecrated, and they're both slaughtered inside the temple, the first animal is fine and valid, and the second is invalid, and there's 40 lashes. If both the animals are unconsecrated and the first is slaughtered outside the temple and the second is slaughtered inside, the first slaughter is fine and valid, the second is invalid, and there's 40 lashes. If both the animals are consecrated and the first is slaughtered outside the temple and the second is slaughtered inside, the first slaughter is invalid and there's liability for kares, the second is invalid and there's 40 lashes for both. If both the animals are unconsecrated and the first is slaughtered inside the temple and the second is slaughtered outside, the first slaughter is invalid with no liability, the second is valid and there's 40 lashes. If both of the animals are consecrated and the first is slaughtered inside the temple and the second is slaughtered outside, the first slaughter is valid with no liability, the second is invalid, and there's 40 lashes. The Gemara quotes sources for this concept further. There's a dispute based on verses if this concept applies to any animal and its offspring, or specifically to females and their offspring, and not males. In the end, it rules that this whole concept applies to both males and females and their offspring. As we see, we rule out this concept in other cases. This is additionally relevant to prohibit mating the product of a forbidden crossbreed with the same species as its own mother, for instance a mule with a female horse. Some say in such a case it would only be permissible to mate it with another mule, although it is agreed it cannot be mated with species of its mother, and there's a doubt if we're concerned with the father's species. It also mentions other forbidden animal crossbreeds, such as the product of a sheep and a goat, which cannot be slaughtered on the same day as its parent, while the product of a goat and a deer can be slaughtered on the same day as its parent. Others say this actually refers to the offspring of the deer and goat and its own child. Further, it said if a male deer and female goat produce offspring, according to the opinion that we're not sure if we're concerned for the paternity of the animal, to be stringent, the animal cannot be slaughtered on a holiday, and if it is slaughtered, its blood is not covered. It additionally debates this case as to what obligations are required by this animal as to whether the blood must be covered during slaughter, if it can be slaughtered on the same day as its parent. There are a few opinions. Some actually disagree with the definition of this animal. Some just say it's its own creature, it's not a crossbreed of two different animals. Some just simply translated the animal as the wild ram. Similarly, the forest goat is disputed as to what type of animal it is and as to whether it can be offered on the altar. Now, our Mishnah stated that if a consecrated animal and its consecrated offspring are offered outside the temple on the same day, there's liability of kares for the first and there's lashes for both. Evidently, this disagrees with the opinion that a slaughter that is invalid is not considered to be an active slaughter, as the first animal was not slaughtered. It was just killed effectively, meaning the second animal should actually have kares for being slaughtered outside the temple if we were holding with this opinion. So there are similar issues by the same principle with other cases, so clearly this Mishnah does not accord with this opinion. This is necessary to state for the case of the slaughter of consecrated animals inside the temple, that slaughter doesn't itself immediately permit the meat, and it's considered to be invalid. There are other violations done in this case of messing up temple offerings by the consecrated animals inside the temple, but it only mentioned the points on the prohibitions against slaughtering an animal with its offspring, and lashes are an extension of this specifically, which is why those are included. Alternatively, it's just that the remaining issues of impurity just don't apply here, based on a verse. Some say the prohibitions against slaughtering an animal with its offspring just don't apply to consecrated animals, as if it's invalid, it's not considered to have been slaughtered, which applies by consecrated animals, so there would be no issue with the offspring, as you basically can't slaughter them in the technical sense on the same day at all. Others dispute this concept at length. It is alternatively suggested that this opinion just holds that the lashes would not apply. In fact, if an unconsecrated offering and its offspring, which is an ola offering, are slaughtered on the same day, it's a debate if there's lashes based on whether the burning of the ola is considered to be a form of consumption, and therefore if the concept of slaughter applies there. New Mishnah: if somebody slaughters an animal and finds that it has a defect, or if it's slaughtered for idolatry, or it's a red heifer, or it's been sentenced to be stoned or to be decapitated, and then he also slaughters its offspring or parent on the same day, there's a dispute if there's liability. If somebody slaughters an animal and he messes it up, so it's improperly slaughtered, and then also its offspring or parents on the same day, it's agreed that there's no liability for this. The Gemara says an opinion. This only applies if the first animal is slaughtered for idolatry and the second animal is slaughtered for eating. If the first animal was slaughtered for eating and the second was slaughtered for idolatry, there's no lashes, as he's already getting the greater sentence of capital punishment. This is said to apply even if the man wasn't warned against his idolatry, meaning capital punishment wouldn't apply here. Although others disagree, saying there would also be liability for the smaller penalty. It also clarifies that the red heifer, which was part of the list, that's just an error and shouldn't be there, as its meat is actually fit for consumption at one point. It debates if the same principle applies by the beheaded calf of the Egla Arofo that was mentioned, as it's technically allowed to be eaten before it's decapitated, although it mostly disputes as to who exactly held this opinion. New Mishnah: if two people buy a cow and its offspring on the same day, whoever bought it first can slaughter it first on that day. If the second buyer anyways slaughtered his animal first, he can still eat of its meat. The Gemara says this is more of a court ruling than anything. It's said to be fine if the second buyer slaughters his earlier, as it's not a transgression and he can profit from this. New Mishnah: if somebody slaughtered a cow and then two of its calves on the same day, he gets 80 lashes. If he slaughtered two calves and then their mother, he only gets 40 lashes. If he slaughtered a cow, its daughter, and its granddaughter on one day, he gets 80 lashes. If he slaughtered a cow, its granddaughter, and then its daughter, it's a debate if he gets 40 or 80 lashes. The Gemara quotes sources for this. These are discussed, and it debates the ending case of the Mishnah as to the individual logics. The one that says there's 80 lashes essentially holds that if somebody does two transgressions in a single lapse of awareness, he would need to bring two offerings, which it spends some time discussing potential sources for. These are additionally discussed, rejecting a number of attempted proofs. New Mishnah: there are 4 times a year where somebody selling an animal must tell the customer that he also sold the animal's mother or child for slaughter earlier that day. These are big holidays where presumably everybody's immediately slaughtering their animals. The eve of the final day of the holiday of Sukkot, the eve of the first day of Passover, the eve of the holiday of Shavuos, the eve of Rosh Hashanah, and according to some, also the eve of Yom Kippur, specifically in the region of Galilee. This applies if the animals are being sold on the same day. If one animal is sold to a bride and the other is sold to a groom, they must be informed about both sales, so that way they won't be slaughtered on the same day. Similarly, on these 4 occasions, a butcher can be forced to slaughter an animal. Essentially, if a customer pays a small amount for some meat, and the butcher later finds that he doesn't have enough customers to make the slaughter worthwhile, he nevertheless needs to fulfill his end to slaughter the animal and supply the meat. Although if the animal dies before slaughter, the loss is incurred by the customer, unlike by the rest of the year. The Gemara says, it mentioned the mother animal being sold to the groom specifically to show that it's common for the groom to invest more into the wedding celebration. The final case is additionally clarified. It said that the customer actually acquired a portion of the animal by drawing it near to himself, although some just say that uniquely on those 4 days, it would be sufficient, at least biblically, to acquire meat via a payment. New Mishnah: regarding this day period where you cannot slaughter an animal and its offspring, this goes by the night until the day. This is actually the definition of a day, according to Jewish law, that it begins by the prior night. As by the creation of the world, it says, and there was evening and there was morning one day, meaning night goes first. The Gemara additionally expounds on this, and that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Chullin covers the requirement to cover the blood of an animal after slaughter. The first Mishnah says, as the verse states, after an animal is slaughtered, its blood is covered with dirt. This would apply both inside and outside of Israel when the temple does and does not exist. It would only apply to unconsecrated animals. It applies to both animals and to birds, whether they were bred domesticated or otherwise. It applies to the product of a deer and a goat hybrid, even though it's in a questionable status of species, and this animal specifically can be slaughtered on a holiday and its blood is not covered. The Gemara quotes sources for this principle that a consecrated animal's blood is not covered after slaughter. There are a few suggested reasons as to why this is the case. It also sources the fact that this applies to both bred domesticated animals and otherwise, quoting a few verses on this. It also mentions a lot of practical advice, like to not spend money on luxuries, to not drink lukewarm water from a metal utensil for health reasons, and further on having restraint with one's spending towards oneself, but to spend lots of money to honor one's wife and children. Based on the impermissibility of covering the blood of a deer-goat hybrid on a holiday, it's disputed if an animal slaughtered for a very sick person on a Shabbos has its blood covered, although it disputes the validity of the principle by the deer-goat hybrid that as it's in a questionable status, it doesn't override the holiday based on a number of other quoted cases. There's further discussion on this. New Mishnah: if somebody slaughters an animal or a bird and finds that it has a defect, or it's slaughtered for idolatry, or it's a consecrated animal outside the temple courtyard, or it's sentenced to be stoned, it's a dispute if its blood needs to be covered. If somebody slaughtered an animal improperly and messes up the process, it's agreed to be exempt from covering its blood. The Gemara says a nearly identical Mishnah was cited in the prior chapter on prohibitions against slaughtering an animal and its offspring on the same day. These opinions here parallel those there as they derive these principles from similar sources. These are discussed along with some particular incidents in these cases. And this goes further. New Mishnah: if a deaf mute, an insane person, or a minor slaughtered an animal while being monitored, the one who is watching them must cover the blood. If this was done in private, the blood doesn't need to be covered as it was an invalid act of slaughter. Similarly, if one of these mentally incompetent people slaughtered an animal while being monitored, it would be prohibited to then slaughter the animal's offspring on the same day. If they were slaughtered in private, it's a dispute if their offspring can be slaughtered. Rabbi Meir says yes, the sages say no, although it is agreed that if somebody does, there's no penalty of lashes. The Gemara explains the reason it's agreed by both that blood isn't covered by the first case. It says people will see the blood be covered and think that the slaughter was allowed and then eat this impermissible meat. By the latter case, you can't really prove anything from the fact that the offspring wasn't slaughtered. However, others just disagree with all of this and say that it's disputed in both cases. It was only just stated by the second case. The reason the first opinion of Rabbi Meir simply doesn't require the covering of the blood or allows the slaughter of its offspring on the same day is that he simply holds that majority of these mentally incompetent people's actions just wind up being done improperly. It sets precedent and disputes further as to who we hold like, in spite of the fact that it's the minority view, we hold like Rabbi Meir here. New Mishnah: if somebody slaughtered 100 animals in one place, he can perform a single act of covering the blood for all of them. The same applies by birds. By an animal and a bird, some say one blood covering is sufficient, others say he should cover the animal's blood and only then slaughter the bird. The Gemara cites sources for all these. The last opinion would concede that if somebody slaughters an animal and a bird, he'd only say one blessing. This is as there's no diversion of attention, unlike by repeatedly drinking and saying after blessings. New Mishnah: if somebody slaughtered an animal or a bird and didn't cover the blood and somebody else saw it, they must cover it. If somebody covered an animal's blood and it became uncovered, he doesn't need to recover it. If the wind covered the blood, he still needs to cover it himself. The Gemara quotes verses on these principles and discusses some related points. When we said if the wind covereth the blood, one must recover it, this is only if it became uncovered, and this is as there's no permanent rejection from mitzvahs. If the blood is otherwise exposed, it must be covered. New Mishnah: if the blood of an animal or bird was mixed with water, if it looks like blood, it must be covered. If it was mixed with wine, the same applies. If it was mixed with blood of some other animal, same applies. It's as if it's mixed with water. Some say that simply blood cannot nullify blood. If blood splattered far away or there was blood remaining on the knife, this still must be covered, although others say that's only if there's no other blood to cover. The Gemara quotes a very similar Mishnah from Tractate Chullin on 77b regarding these principles of blood mixtures, where it said that this applies only if water fell into blood. If blood falls into water, each individual drop would be nullified as it falls in. It's said this does not apply here as there's no permanent rejection from mitzvahs. It said blood that's any shade of red can atone through being applied to the altar. It's susceptible to impurity, and it must be covered. This is mainly stated for the principle on impurity, saying if blood directly mixed with rainwater by itself, if it's red, it still has the status of blood. It qualifies measurements and ratios. These principles of impurity are additionally discussed, and it also sources the dispute as to if splattered, distant blood, or knife blood needs to be covered. New Mishnah: blood can be covered with fine feces, fine sand, lime, ground pottery, crushed brick, and a crushed earthenware pot cover. It cannot be covered with coarse feces, coarse sand, a non-crushed brick, or a non-crushed cover of an earthenware pot, or any inverted vessel. Some say as a general rule, if plants can grow in the substance, it can be used to cover blood, otherwise not. The Gemara additionally defines these substances and disputes essentially as to whether sand that can be crumbled by hand can be used. It additionally spends some time sourcing these. Anyways, it said that blood can only be covered with a substance in which seeds can be planted and sprout in. This is based on a quoted case. Some say earth must be used, others say even ash is fine. For instance, it said that as Abraham said, "Though I am but earth and ashes," we merited to have the obligations of the ashes of the red heifer and the earth of the sota. Covering the blood with earth is not mentioned, as there's no immediate benefit from that. It's also said, as Abraham said, if so much as a thread or a shoe strap, we merited to have the mitzvahs of tzitzis and tefillin. It additionally discusses these and further on the fact that Abraham refused to accept even this from the kings of Sodom, as it shows that stolen property is so severe as even the righteous cannot return it. It further speaks on Abraham and the great importance of humility, and also how incredibly humble Moshe and Aaron were, saying that the whole world exists only because of their great humility. This is based on a verse, although some interpret it to mean that the whole world exists only because of those that stay silent when they're provoked. Others say it's for those that allow themselves to be downtrodden. Anyway, some say we can cover blood with earth from the city destroyed for idolatry, specifically with its hard earth, as that's not subject to burning. Although others say even its ashes could just be used, as there's no benefit derived here, as one doesn't derive benefit from mitzvahs. It also explains how this would not apply by a shofar or by a lulav, which, if it's used for idolatry, could still be used after the fact. These aren't, anyways, comparable to dirt for covering blood, as an item which is used for idolatry is considered to be destroyed, but here, the more destroyed the earth is, it's better for covering blood. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Chullin covers the laws of the sciatic nerve, the Gid Hanosha. The first Mishnah says, as the verse states, when Yaakov, Jacob, fought against an angel prior to meeting his brother Esav, his hip was injured, and it says, therefore the children of Israel are not to eat the Gid Hanasha that is on the bone of the thigh to this day, because he struck the spoon of Jacob's thigh on the displaced sinew. The Gid Hanasha is the sciatic nerve, which is a forbidden part of any animal to eat. This applies both inside and outside of Israel, both when the temple does and does not exist, to unconsecrated and consecrated animals, to wild and domesticated animals, to both the right and left leg, although it does not apply to birds as their leg is shaped differently. It's a debate if this applies to an animal fetus, along with if its forbidden fats are allowed. Rabbi Meir says, as the sciatic nerve is so complex to remove, we don't trust that butchers remove it properly, while the sages say we can trust that they remove this, and also forbidden fats. The Gemara says, we specified that this obligation to remove the sciatic nerve applies to consecrated animals. This is a bit obvious, so it's explained to teach that if a consecrated animal has a child, its consecration and the prohibition of the sciatic nerve take effect simultaneously when it's a fetus. This would be according to the disputed point that the sciatic nerve must be removed from an animal fetus. However, it is suggested that as the fetus's sinews only develop after its limbs, its consecration should technically come first. So it answers that's true, but the sciatic nerve prohibition still takes effect simultaneously, as it's stricter in that it applies to everybody in the world. This is disproven, however, as this sciatic nerve issue, which applies by everybody with a non-kosher animal as a prohibition, while the law against eating a consecrated animal is punished with kares, divine punishment, which is much stricter. So there are two suggested explanations as to what the Mishnah is talking about, either that it's an unconsecrated animal giving birth to a firstborn, which is consecrated from the womb, or it's a regular consecrated animal offspring, but according to the opinion that it's only consecrated once it's actually born, and not before. We've been discussing prohibitions of the sciatic nerve and offerings that are eaten. If they're not eaten, they're just totally burnt on the altar, such as the Ola offering. It's a dispute as to if the sciatic nerve must be removed. This is a point largely debated from verses as to if certain sinews and bones are included in the offering. This was particularly disputed by the Ola offering, as some said to remove the sciatic nerve and place it on the ash mound on the altar, and others disagreed. Somewhat related, it said that the ash mound in the center of the altar was massive and had 300 car of ashes, which is a ridiculously large amount, although then it clarifies that this was an exaggeration, and it gives a few other examples of times the Gemara exaggerates measurements by the temple, although that'll be discussed more in the later tractate Talmud. We said this prohibition of the sciatic nerve applies to the right and to the left leg. However, others actually disagree and say it's only for one leg, which should logically be the right. We know that this opinion definitely holds it's only one side, as he later rules if somebody ate two sciatic nerves from two different animals, he only gets 40 lashes. Now, as he rules this as a law, he must be certain as to which side is actually prohibited and which side isn't, as otherwise, if he was uncertain, it might have been that this man is eating the sciatic nerve from the permissible side. The reason that there would only be 40 lashes in this case is that he's eating the minimum olive volume across both legs, meaning he's having a half by both. The debate on if the prohibition against the sciatic nerve applies to both legs or to one leg is based on interpretation of verses. It discusses these verses, and also on the incident where Jacob was wounded. It said he went back to be alone when he was attacked, as he was going to regather some small jars that he had left, as the righteous are always very careful with their property, as they never steal. It's also said that we can learn from this that a person should never go out alone at night. It speaks on some other verses. It says, he took the stone that he had placed by his head, which is in singular, even though in the verse just beforehand it referred to the stones in plural, to show that all the stones that Jacob slept on gathered into one stone that he lay on. It then speaks on Jacob's ladder, which was said to be massive and had angels heading up and down. And it was by Jacob fighting the angel said it had to leave as it was dawn in the verse. This was as it was an angel who had to recite songs at this point for God. It's disputed as to when exactly they do this and what the words are precisely. It also speaks in the dreams by Joseph, later on by the chamberlain of the cupbearers who dreamed of a grapevine with 3 branches. There are a bunch of interpretations as to what this refers to. Some say it's the 3 ministering angels of the nations. Some say it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some say it's Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Some say it's the temple, the king, and the Kohen Gadol. There are a few other interpretations. It additionally expounds on the interpretation of other various verses. Anyways, we said the prohibitions against eating the sciatic nerve don't apply to birds, as their thigh bone isn't spoon-shaped. If it was spoon-shaped, or if an animal's bone was uniquely not spoon-shaped, that's unresolved. When we said that the animal fetus's forbidden fats are permitted, that's unanimous, and it further defines what this refers to, which is that it's the fat of the sciatic nerve which is only prohibited rabbinically. Its source is this. Some say that the sciatic nerve's edible offshoots are what's forbidden, as the actual nerve is inedible anyways. Others say both are prohibited. It suggests it's like the former, as we see by forbidden fats and by kidneys, that the interior nerves and blood vessels, which are inedible, are not prohibited. It's just the actual meat around them that is. It more particularly describes which fats exactly in certain areas of the cow's many stomachs are prohibited to be eaten. It said that a cubit's length of the duodenum must have its fat removed. It describes some specific nerves that must be extracted, and also some prohibited membranes. The membrane around the spleen, the flanks, and the kidneys are prohibited due to the forbidden fats around them, while the membrane around the testicles and the brain are forbidden due to the blood. It additionally describes these organs and which parts are precisely impermissible. Further, if there's meat with a red discoloration, the testicles, and the blood vessels of the neck, there is a dispute by those 3 if there's concern of blood within them. Some say you need to fully cut and salt them to remove the blood. Others say it would be sufficient to just roast them to remove the blood. Or if somebody had a severed cow head placed in hot ashes, if it's placed with the cut facing down, it would be permitted, as all the blood would flow out. If it was placed on its side, it would be prohibited, as the blood would congeal inside the animal. If it was placed on its nostrils, it would be permitted only if something was inserted into the nostril to drain the blood out. Some say this would even be allowed if something was inserted to the skull when the head was on its side to drain the blood out. Anyways, it said there are actually 2 main nerves in the thigh. The main one we refer to is the sciatic nerve, which is prohibited, but there's also the peroneal nerve down here, which is prohibited, although only rabbinically. These are described. Also, if a butcher's meat is found with forbidden fats, if there's an olive's volume, he would receive lashes. If there was a barley corn's volume, he'd be removed from his position. It does say that in the later generations, it became accepted to trust butchers to remove the sciatic nerve, as they started going according to the stricter opinion that requires the total removal of the nerve, including all the parts embedded deeply into the thigh. The dispute as to who we trust, as mentioned, extended also to forbidden fats. New Mishnah. It's permitted to send an animal thigh to a non-Jewish person without removing the sciatic nerve, without concern of a Jewish man then purchasing it, as it's easily discernible that it's still there. The Gemara says, evidently there would be a concern if the meat was cut up first, so there are 2 explanations of the case. The first is that they announce where it's permitted to buy meat from a non-Jewish person, and there's no concern that he'll cut up the meat and make the sciatic nerve unidentifiable, as the cutting of the meat by a non-Jewish person would be identifiable, or it's where they just don't make such announcements, and the issue with giving up meat to a non-Jewish person is that he might give it in front of another Jewish man who then mistakenly think it's permitted and buy it. Alternatively, is that the issue is with selling a cut-up piece of meat to a non-Jewish person, as he'll mistakenly think you removed the sciatic nerve, which means you misled him, and it's forbidden to mislead anybody, including a non-Jewish person. It gives instances of this, and further speaks on the necessity of being extremely honest with all individuals, and that you absolutely cannot deceive anybody in any way, which it gives examples of in business and otherwise. It's said, if somebody sells an animal thigh to a Jewish man, it only needs to have the sciatic nerve removed if it's cut up. Removing the sciatic nerve from meat sold to a non-Jewish person is not strictly necessary. However, there are 2 reasons that selling improperly slaughtered animals or animals with defects to a non-Jewish person should not be done. First, that it's dishonest and misleading, and also out of concern that it could then be sold to a Jewish person. Similarly, a person shouldn't have a non-Jewish person buy meats for him in case he just steals the money or in case he buys improperly slaughtered pieces. By these listed clauses, it would have to be that the first and last clause only make sense if it's a case where they announce who's selling the meat, if it's a non-Jewish person to see if it's permissible, and the middle clause is where this doesn't occur. Alternatively, the whole thing deals with where this announcement is made. It's just that the first and last clause are where they announce the animal had a defect, unlike by the middle case, Alternatively, there's that all the cases are where they don't announce whether it's prohibited to buy meat from certain people. It's just that there was a general prohibition made against selling meat to non-Jewish people out of concern that if it was done in the presence of a Jewish person, then they'll wind up purchasing it from him. It describes the process of making these announcements as to which meat vendors were allowed. It discusses some particular cases. In fact, it said that once meat is out of sight, it's prohibited, out of concern that it was switched by an animal with non-kosher meat. This does not apply by a non-Jewish vendor who would take care to not allow such a thing. Some say if somebody found raw meat in a city, we say it's kosher based on the majority of the city's butchers. If it's cooked, it goes by majority of those in the city that eat meat. Evidently here in this case, there would be no concern of a raven having swapped the meat out, as somebody was watching the meat from when it fell until when it was found. This case is additionally discussed. According to those that say if meat ever goes out of your sight, it's prohibited, this would mean he'd either have to watch the meat from the moment of slaughter until he gets it and just never leave it unsupervised, or it means that it's been tied and sealed, or it means that the meat has an identifying mark, like that it's been cut into a specific shape. It discusses some cases and also briefly speaks on the concept of good omens. If pieces of meat were all tied together with a cord, that's said to be a sufficient sign to be an identifying mark. Some said it was enough to retain his meat just based purely off of visual recognition. It was said visual recognition would also be enough to retain a spool of techeles thread to then make tzitzis with it. By this we see, unlike by typical laws of returning lost objects, visual recognition is actually more effective than an identifying mark, and it gives further proofs for this from other cases. New Mishnah. If somebody removes the sciatic nerve from meat, it must be entirely removed. Rabbi Yehuda says it can just have the portion above the meat removed. If somebody eats an olive's volume of the sciatic nerve, there's 40 lashes. If he ate the whole thing, even if it was less than an olive's volume, there's still lashes. If somebody eats an olive's volume of a sciatic nerve from one leg and also from the other leg, he gets 80 lashes, but Rabbi Yehuda says he only gets 40. The Gemara describes an incident of somebody removing the sciatic nerve and disputes if he did it in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda or not, as if he just removed the biblically required section or everything, even what's rabbinically required. Some say that the prohibited portion of the sciatic nerve is only what lies on the spoon-shaped part of the upper thigh bone. Those that say that there's liability for eating the entire sciatic nerve, they would say that even if it was less than an olive's volume, as an entire whole entity was eaten. It additionally disputes between these based on verses. New Mishnah. If an animal's thigh was actually cooked with the sciatic nerve still inside, if there's enough that the sciatic nerve imparts flavor, it would be prohibited. This is calculated as if meat was cooked alongside turnips as to whether or not there would be a flavor transfer. If a sciatic nerve was cooked with other permitted sinews, if somebody recognizes the sciatic nerve, the mixture is prohibited only if there's a flavor mixture. If he doesn't recognize which is which, everything is prohibited. If they were in a soup, everything would be prohibited no matter what is or isn't recognized, as there is a flavor transfer. Also, with a piece of meat of an improperly slaughtered animal or a piece of non-kosher fish, if they were cooked with kosher slices, if they're recognized, they're only prohibited if there's a flavor transfer. If they're not recognized, everything is prohibited. And if they're in a soup, no matter if anything is recognized, everything's prohibited due to the flavor transfer. The Gemara says, the first point applies if the nerve was cooked with the meat. If it was roasted, it can be peeled and eaten up until the sciatic nerve. This wouldn't apply by forbidden fats, as they're fatty and permeate into the entire meat. A case is brought where it was allowed to peel and eat until the forbidden fats, but that's either it was a particularly lean animal, or it was a kidney that was roasted with forbidden fats, not a whole animal, or the case didn't involve roasting, it was a pot of meat with a small not kosher fish inside, so they had a non-Jewish cook taste it to see if there was a flavor transfer. Based on this, we see by forbidden mixtures of meat and milk, we can rely on a non-Jewish cook to see if there was a flavor transfer as to if they're forbidden. Essentially, to clarify, if a food is mixed with a different type of food, it's known if it's not kosher based on if there's a flavor transfer, and if a food mixes with its own type, so you can't tell the difference via the taste, or just generally if there's no one you can have to taste the food, then the forbidden mixture is nullified by a 60th. It brings cases of this. Regarding a forbidden food being nullified by a 60th, this measurement would include the soup it's mixed in along with the sediments, the permitted pieces, and the pot. Although some say this means the actual pot is included in the calculation, and others say it just means the foods that are absorbed into the pot that are included. Some say all forbidden foods have their nullification and mixtures calculated by as if they were an onion or a leek, which impart taste stronger than any other food. Anyways, the sciatic nerve is nullified in a mixture of 60 times itself, excluding the actual sciatic nerve. An udder, however, is nullified by 60 times, including the actual udder, although the udder itself is prohibited. This is as we measure against the udder itself. An egg is nullified by 60 times, excluding the actual egg. An egg doesn't really impart any flavor when it's cooked with other foods, so this is explained to possibly refer to an unhatched egg that contains a chick. It discusses other specific cases of measurement nullification. By an egg, in the end, it rules that it needs to have 61 times itself to be permitted. There are other cases. It was established that foods are nullified in measures of 60 times itself. This actually wasn't agreed on initially, and some held it had to be in measures of 100 times itself. This was disputed based on some verses. It revolves around the case of a foreleg being cooked with the rest of a ram of an offering, and some say we measure the meat and bones of the leg against the meat and bones of the ram, which would be 60 times, while others say we measure the meat of the leg against the meat of the ram, which was 100 times itself. Others just say that this whole case is an exception, although some just say that's in regards to the concept that flavor has the same status as substance, as here that wouldn't apply and the flavor of the consecrated offering would be permitted. This case is additionally discussed, and it further disputes the concept that nullification occurs in mixtures of 100 as opposed to 60. It disputes this from some additional laws of tithes and discusses several particular food mixtures. We said if the sciatic nerve is mixed with meat, it imparts flavor like meat to a turnip. This is explained to refer to turnip leaves. Also, this is just unlike the opinion that says sinews don't impart flavor, which was a disputed point, although in the end it holds that sciatic nerves do not impart flavor. The reason a sciatic nerve is not nullified when mixed with the other permitted sinews, as mentioned earlier, it's a complete entity, so it's too significant. Similarly, a prohibited slice of non-kosher fish isn't being nullified when it's mixed with other pieces, as it's significant, as it's fit to be served by itself to guests. So there is both of those reasons, by the fish and by the sciatic nerve. There is a concept quoted that if a non-kosher slice of meat is mixed with 60 times itself, it's nullified, as mentioned. However, if it imparts flavor to a permitted slice, that piece itself becomes impermissible, which then makes the greater mixture prohibited, as it's no longer 60 times itself. This is where the forbidden piece was originally separated, but this still works even if it wasn't, as it's a mixture of food with a different type of food, and in such a scenario we ignore all the like types of food, and it would then require all of the other foods in the pot on their own to equal over 60 times to nullify the forbidden piece itself. New Mishnah. The prohibition against the sciatic nerve applies to kosher animals, and it's a debate if it also applies to non-kosher animals. Some say yes, as when the law was given towards Jacob, that was before the laws of kosher even existed. Others say no, as these laws of the sciatic nerve were stated by Mount Sinai with the laws of kosher. It was just written way earlier in the Torah at its relevant spot. The Gemara says, this opinion which says that the sciatic nerve of a non-kosher animal is prohibited evidently holds that a prohibition can take effect on a pre-existing prohibition. It debates if he holds this principle from a bunch of other discussions regarding these laws of the sciatic nerve. In fact, if somebody actually ate the sciatic nerve of a non-kosher animal, one opinion would say he gets 2 sets of lashes for eating of a non-kosher animal and for eating a sciatic nerve, while others say he would be entirely exempt, as he holds the verse implies an exemption by non-kosher animals entirely. If somebody eats the sciatic nerve of a kosher animal that was improperly slaughtered, some say there would be 2 sets of lashes, others say just 1. It is, however, agreed, if somebody eats the sciatic nerve of an olah offering, or of an animal that was condemned to be stoned, he's liable for 2 sets of lashes. Evidently, the opinion which said there was 1 set of lashes by the first case holds that a prohibition can take effect on a pre-existing prohibition, but an inclusive, stringent prohibition won't take effect over a pre-existing prohibition. It tries to figure out who holds like this based on some other discussed cases. It discusses these regarding principles of Shabbos and Yom Kippur and similar. We said an opinion that the obligation to not eat the sciatic nerve was actually brought by Mount Sinai, but was mentioned much earlier in the Torah as it was relevant over there. It additionally expounds on this concept. Similarly, there's a dispute as to whether the prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal applies to non-kosher animals. It disputes this between verses, which are then additionally discussed. Also, it's mentioned that this whole dispute applied by Jewish people. By non-Jewish people, everybody agrees that this prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal applies to all animals, kosher and non-kosher. This is additionally sourced. Also, it mentions the prohibited minimum of such a limb would be like all other eating prohibitions in olives volume. It's also taught that a small amount of flesh plus sinews and bones that equal an olive's volume would not incur lashes for its consumption. It mentions similar cases, and also if somebody eats an entire live kosher bird, some say there'd be liability for this even if it was under the volume of an olive, as it's ready for division into limbs. Others seem to say it goes by his intent, as to if he's looking at the bird as one entity, or as a collection of limbs, essentially. Anyways, it cites the verse sources for the fact that flesh from a living animal cannot be eaten, and the particular violations this would incur. For instance, based on these, depending on the verse, if somebody eats the limb of a living animal and the flesh of a living animal, some say this is 1 violation, others say it's 2, or if somebody eats the flesh of a living animal and the flesh of an animal with a defect, it's a debate if this is 1 or 2 violations. If somebody eats the limb of a living animal and the flesh of an animal with a defect, everybody agree that's 2 liabilities. Others dispute this last one, and there's some further discussion. Or if somebody eats forbidden fats that were detached from a living animal with a defect, some say that's 2 violations, some say that's 3. This disagreement would be where the animal was injured at birth, as some hold that an animal is ready to be divided into limbs while it's alive, meaning all of these prohibitions of forbidden fats, eating living limbs, and defects would apply, although others say it's not ready to be divided when it's alive, so only the prohibitions of forbidden fats and defects apply, not eating living limbs. Alternatively, it's that everybody agrees that an animal, while it's alive, isn't ready for division into limbs. They just disagree as to whether the prohibition of living limbs can take effect on top of the prohibition against forbidden fats. Or, alternatively, it's that everybody agrees that while an animal is alive, it's ready to be divided into limbs, and the dispute is where it got the defect afterwards, and it's as to whether the prohibition of a defect can take effect on top of the pre-existing prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal. It's said if somebody splits an olive-sized piece of the limb of a living animal and eats both halves separately, there's no liability. If this was done inside of the man's mouth, there would be liability. Others say that's a dispute, as both ends went down his throat, although others say not, as the olive's volume must enter his stomach at once, and according to this last view, that the only way it'd really be possible to be liable for eating the limb of a living animal, as people chew food, so they're never actually eating a full olive's volume, unless they swallow a small bone, for example, which would be the only way that would be really possible there. Others disagree with all of this, and say even if the volume is divided outside of the mouth, there's still liability, as the divided proximity doesn't really count as a factor here. There's a dispute if the olive's volume includes what's stuck in somebody's teeth. If somebody ate half an olive's volume of a forbidden food and then threw it up and then ate another half, it's a dispute based on if we go by what's benefited the stomach or the throat as to what's considered eating. It's said he would be liable as it goes by what's in somebody's throat. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Chullin covers the laws of the forbidden mixture of meat and milk. The first Mishnah says, as will be discussed a bit more later in the tractate, the verse says, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." This is explained to mean that all types of meat are forbidden to be cooked with milk, besides for fish and locust, which would be allowed with milk. It's also forbidden to have all types of meat on a table with cheese, again, besides for fish or locusts. Somebody who vows to abstain from meat can still eat fish or locusts. The Gemara asks who this is in accordance with, as apparently this Mishnah considers bird meat to be biblically prohibited with milk, but regarding the point on vows, it would seem to be like the opinion that any prohibited item that was vowed against would include categories that are questionably of its type. It gives a few opinions that could fit this view. Anyways, we said that all meats cannot be placed on the same table as cheese. This implies that bird meat is biblically forbidden with milk, as the fact that it can't be on the same table is a rabbinically instituted precaution. And if bird meat was only rabbinically prohibited, that would be stacking 2 rabbinic precautions. It proves from other cases that stacking rabbinic precautions is not something that's done. So it's answered it's only one encompassing rabbinic prohibition, that bird meat and cheese cannot be eaten on the same table, which is made out of concern that regular meat and cheese will be brought together in a primary vessel on a table, which that itself would be biblically prohibited. New Mishnah. Beis Shammai says bird meat can be placed on the same table as cheese, but it can't actually be eaten with cheese. Beis Hillel says bird meat can't even be placed on the same table with cheese. Rabbi Yossi says this is one of the few times that Beis Shammai rules more leniently than Beis Hillel. Also, this prohibition against placing foods in the same table applies by the table you're actually eating on. It would be fine if that's just where the food is being arranged. The Gemara explains the reason Rabbi Yossi mentioned his statement is because he was the author of the Mishnah. Some say it's permissible to eat bird meat and then cheese without washing one's hands and mouth in between. If somebody eats cheese and then regular meat, some say he must wash his hands in between only by night when he can't actually see if his hands are clean or not. Others say he needs to wipe his mouth in between, and others say he needs to rinse his mouth. Some explain this to mean that the opinions just totally agree with each other. They're both saying that wiping and rinsing is required. Some say that wiping one's mouth can only be done with cold, soft wheat bread, although it's ruled that it can be done with any food besides for flour, dates, and vegetables. Anyway, some hold that there's no time at all that must be waited between eating cheese and meat. If somebody eats meat first, there's a concern that there's still some meat stuck in his mouth, so a period of time must be waited, although it's disputed as to how long exactly. Some would wait a full 24 hours, although others would just wait until the next meal. It gives other examples of practices that were done less stringently than in prior generations. On the topic of hand washing, it said that the water we wash with before eating bread is a mitzvah, but the water we wash with after eating by the after blessing is an obligation. This is additionally expounded on. Some say both washings are obligatory, and it's a dispute if the final washings can be done over wood chips, as it must be done into a vessel of some sort. It's also said that the last washing must be with cold water to remove grease. The first washing before a meal can be with very hot water. The middle washing between courses is totally optional, unless somebody is eating meat and then cheese in between. It said that washing after a meal is to get rid of salts that could cause blindness, so washing is also definitely done after working with salt. It said we don't wash over the ground to prevent a harmful spirit going to that area and harming people, and it also gives other examples like to not leave breadcrumbs lying around, as that could cause poverty, and a bunch of other miscellaneous practices that can cause types of illnesses or make somebody susceptible to witchcraft. For example, so that eating vegetables directly from a bundle could make somebody susceptible to witchcraft, among some other listed things. Also, it's said to not sit under a drain pipe, as that's where demons are prevalent. It gives an example of this and the subsequent banishing of that demon. It expounds on further health-related practices. It's a dispute if washing one's hands before a meal can be done with water heated with fire. It's a dispute if the hot springs of Tiberias could be used for hand washing, which is discussed. It's also disputed as to if water that was drunk from by an animal could be used. Anyways, it said that washing one's hands before eating bread was established as a custom, as it was necessary to wash one's hands before the eating of teruma tithes, and also because it itself is a mitzvah, as was instituted by the sages. It is said that this really should only be done before eating bread. The washing must be done until one's first finger joint. Washing before eating teruma tithes must be done until the next joint, and the washing of the Kohanim in the temple was until the next joint after that. The same interpositions that apply by a mikveh apply here also. There are other opinions as to where exactly this hand washing must go until on the actual hand. Some say, particularly in areas with scarce water, they could wash in the morning to cover for the rest of the entire day. Others say this is only allowed in times of pressing need. Further, it said you can't just stick your hand into a canal. The pouring must be done through the force of a person. If there's a pail with a hole in the bottom that's sending water into a canal, it's said to be allowed to wash one's hands in that canal. Washing one's hands in just the perforated bucket would not be allowed, as it's got a hole in it, so it's no longer considered to be a vessel. Also, a vessel must be able to hold a minimum of a revis of water to be used for hand washing. It's also said that somebody can't use the cover of a cask for hand washing, and gives further examples. If somebody eats bread wrapped in a cloth, he still needs to wash his hands beforehand. This is seen in some cases of eating teruma tithes. Also, if somebody is feeding somebody else bread, that's similarly disputed, and it quotes a case that implies hand washing beforehand would still be necessary to eat it. It rules in the end that he would need to wash his hands beforehand. As for the feeder, he would not need to wash his hands. New Mishnah. A person can wrap meat and cheese in a cloth together as long as they don't actually touch each other. Also, it said that if two men eat their own meals at the same table, one can be meat and the other could be cheese, and it would be fine. The Gemara says there's no real issue of dry meat and dry cheese touching each other, but if they do, they must be rinsed, so it's still prohibited to do this. Also, when we said two men can eat meat and cheese respectively at the same table, this only applies if they don't know each other. If they do know each other, it would be prohibited in case they share and end up mixing their food together, and it supports this from a few quoted cases. If there are two brothers who know each other, but they just don't get along very well, they still can't eat at the same table, as seen by some other cases, as we're worried that people will see this without the context and think that such a thing is typically allowed. New Mishnah. If a drop of milk falls onto a piece of meat in a pot, if it's enough to impart flavor to that slice, it's prohibited. If you then stirred the pot, if there was enough of the drop to impart flavor to the whole pot, it would be prohibited. The Gemara disputes as to whether these laws of meat and milk are an exception, as to if we can learn from this by all other laws of kosher that foods combine with a flavor transfer alone. We said if one single piece of meat has milk land on it, it becomes prohibited. Now, some say this refers to the contents of the entire pot, as essentially the single slice becomes then prohibited, and that creates a much larger forbidden piece than just the single drop initially, which is now large enough to make the entire pot invalid. This concept is called chaticha na'asas nevela, and is particularly relevant in some more complex areas of the laws of kosher. He would additionally hold this prohibition applies even when it's possible to squeeze the prohibited flavor out of the food. It debates sources for this. Related, it said if somebody cooks half an olive's volume of meat with half an olive's volume of milk, it said there's no lashes for cooking it, but there would be lashes for eating it. This would apply if they were taken separately from a large pot where there was an olive's volume of meat and an olive's volume of milk that was cooked within it. Others disagree and say that there would actually be lashes for cooking such a mixture. Anyways, it says regarding a piece of meat that can have milk squeezed back out, it said if they're in a pot, if the pot wasn't covered or stirred, it makes the rest of the contents of the pot prohibited, as they're of the same type. If it was covered or stirred, it would need to impart flavor to the soup, to the sediments, and to all the rest of the meat pieces. This latter opinion would hold the pot was stirred only at the end, and if the flavor could be squeezed out of the slice, it would still be prohibited. According to the first opinion, if the pot was stirred the entire time, there's still a concern the first slice absorbed milk flavor, as perhaps it wasn't stirred well enough. Anyways, the point is from all this shows that it's agreed that if meat can have milk squeezed back out, it's still prohibited. It tries to debate this further by reinterpreting the case with the stirred pot, but that's largely unsuccessful. New Mishnah. The udder of an animal is a meat that is filled with milk, so it's complicated to prepare it. It needs to be torn open and have its milk extracted. If this isn't done, there's no transgression. Similarly, the heart is filled with a forbidden substance, being blood. It also needs to be torn open and have its blood extracted, and if this isn't done, there's no transgression. The Gemara clarifies, by just eating the udder without extracting the milk, that's not even a rabbinic prohibition, although this leniency doesn't apply by the heart, which is why that wasn't mentioned. Others disagree and say that eating the udder isn't a biblical transgression, but it actually is a rabbinic one. It's suggested that tearing the heart open after cooking would be sufficient, but not necessarily so by the udder. Anyways, on the actual process of tearing the udder, it's torn lengthwise and then widthwise, and it's then pressed against the surface to extract out all the milk. If it's being roasted, just a tear would be sufficient. Some teach that anything prohibited has a corresponding thing that's permitted. For instance, blood is forbidden to eat, but a liver is permitted, or pork is forbidden, but the brains of the shabuta fish, which apparently taste the same, is permitted. It gives other examples. Anyways, point of this is that milk and meat are prohibited, but it is allowed to roast and eat in udder, which according to some requires no tearing at all. This is said to be permitted even initially. In fact, there are a number of disputes as to if practically udders should or should not be eaten, and if so, how. This is discussed, and additionally on how to cook a liver, as it's permitted by itself, as it doesn't reabsorb blood that it's emitting, but it's disputed if it could be cooked alongside other foods. If a liver was soaked in vinegar, it's said the vinegar should be prohibited, and then perhaps also the liver, as it could reabsorb the blood that it emitted. Some say it was necessary when preparing a liver to cut it lengthwise and widthwise and then roast it face down, although none of this would be required with a spleen. If a liver was roasted above other meats on a vertical spit, it said it's fine, as the blood would run off everything into the fire. If it was the udder, that would be prohibited, as the milk would cling to the meat. Others say that perhaps the udder would be prohibited rabbinically and the liver would be prohibited biblically. The law is held that both of these would be fine below the meat, and both shouldn't be placed above the meat, but if that was done, then it's fine. If there was a pan placed beneath the liver that's underneath the meat, it would be prohibited, as the liver blood would flow to the top and mix with the meat. If a knife was used to slaughter an animal, it can't then be cut with hot foods. If it was cutting cold foods, it's a debate if it needs rinsing. Also, a plate in which meat was salted cannot have hot foods eaten from it. Salted foods are like they're hot by these laws of mixtures and flavor transfers, and pickled foods are like they're cooked. Others disagree. Related, it said, if a plate had meat salted on it, you cannot eat hot food on it, but a radish that was cut with a meat knife can then be eaten with dairy products. It's disputed as to why, and it's explained that the radish can be tasted to see if there's no meat flavor initially, but you can't do this with the meat plate, assuming there's no non-Jewish person available to taste it for you. Also, if hot fish was placed onto a meat plate, it's a debate if you could then eat that fish with a dairy product, as to whether there was a flavor transfer or only a transfer of a flavor transfer. It disputes the validity of the source for these opinions and discusses some related cases. In the end, it holds the law is that a hot fish placed onto a meat plate can then be eaten with dairy product, while a radish that was cut with a meat knife cannot be eaten with dairy. This is unique by a radish, as it's a sharper vegetable, so it absorbs more, unlike by other vegetables. Related, it's said to be forbidden to place a jug of salt next to a jug of dairy product, in case the dairy product enters the salt, which would then be used for meat. Placing vinegar next to the dairy would be fine, as if the dairy mixes in, it would be identifiable. It brings particular cases of this. If meat was cut on a loaf of bread, if the bread reddened with thick liquid all the way through, it's not kosher as it's absorbed the blood. It's also said that you can't place a tray under roasting meat to catch fats until all of the blood is drained out, and as it's difficult to tell when exactly this is, salt should just be placed onto the tray and the fat should be poured out. This is different from when the meat was cut on top of bread, as the knife pressure there draws out more blood. If fish and bird are salted together, the fish is prohibited, as it absorbs blood from the bird. This applies even in a perforated vessel, as the fish's skin is softer, so it lets out all its blood first and then absorbs the rest from the chicken. If meat of a properly slaughtered animal was salted with meat with a defect, it's said that there will be a blood absorption and it's forbidden. It disputes sources for these and for some related cases. It also describes the salting process. It said it needs to be rinsed and then salted and then rinsed again. It said thick salt should be used and then shaken off. We also don't assume there's blood in the innards regarding the rectum, stomach, and large intestines. Salted meat must be placed on a perforated dish, and some would only do it one piece at a time, although that's rejected by some, as there wouldn't be blood reuptake even by a single piece. If an animal is slaughtered and before it dies its neck is broken, it said this is bad for the meat quality and it causes the limbs to be saturated with blood, which causes use. New Mishnah. Bird meat and cheese on the same table has no transgression. The Gemara says that doesn't imply that eating them together is a biblical transgression, it's just that it's not done so that way people don't then do this with regular meat. New Mishnah. Kosher meat and kosher milk cannot be cooked together or benefited from. Kosher meat and non-kosher milk, or non-kosher meat and kosher milk, can be cooked and benefited from. Rabbi Akiva says, undomesticated animals are not biblically prohibited against being cooked with milk, as the verse states, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, 3 separate times, which he says is to exclude undomesticated animals, birds, and non-kosher animals. Rabbi Yossi Aglili disagrees. He says this verse is stated right after a prohibition against eating improperly slaughtered animals to show that anything subject to being improperly slaughtered cannot be eaten with milk. The exception to this is birds, as their mothers don't even have milk. The Gemara explains this doesn't just refer to kids, as the verse states, as the word for kid used in scripture is frequently used and could refer to the offspring of other animals if it's not actually specified as being a goat. There are a few interpretations as to what the point of listing this verse 3 times was, as to what this exactly teaches us. It said that the word kid is repeated 3 times to teach that this applies to an animal that dies without slaughter, to an animal fetus, and to exclude blood and the placenta and non-kosher animals. It specifies of its mother to exclude milk from a male animal and milk of a slaughtered animal and milk of a non-kosher animal. This reflects on a broader debate as to whether a prohibition can take effect upon a pre-existing prohibition. Also, the implication of the verse also is said to prohibit cooking meat in the milk of a female animal that never nurses, as it would eventually become a mother at some point. If somebody cooks forbidden fats with milk, it's a dispute as to if there's lashes on this, as to whether a prohibition can take effect on a pre-existing prohibition. Alternatively, they agree that that doesn't exist, and they dispute as to whether cooking is an issue here. There's further variation on this as to whether the prohibition against mixing meat and milk applies to forbidden fats. It is said that there's no liability for cooking meat in whey, and it gives sources for this in all the remaining points, prohibiting all animals' milks with animal meats besides for just the kid. It additionally discusses these. Anyways, it also discusses the source for the principle that such a forbidden mixture of meat and milk can't just be made, it also can't be eaten or benefited from. There are a number of different verses suggested on this. Some say it's as it said, "You shall not eat any abomination," meaning anything that's prohibited as abominable also cannot be eaten. It disputes this from some laws of forbidden plant mixtures. Alternatively, it suggested that we can't eat milk and meat mixtures from the verse, "You shall not eat it partially roasted or cooked," where in Hebrew the word cooked is written twice, possibly to prohibit eating an additional form of cooking, being mixtures of meat and milk, although that's disputed. There are other suggested sources from verses, although the one that's generally accepted as tradition is, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk," as it's listed 3 separate times throughout scripture, which is explained to be 3 times, once to prohibit eating, once to prohibit benefiting, and once to prohibit cooking. It suggests some additional alternative options, but that's generally the quoted reason. These are additionally discussed, and there's actually some listed opinions that actually hold it would be permitted to benefit from such a mixture, but those are largely rejected. It further expounds on the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili as to whether undomesticated animal meat is prohibited to be mixed with milk biblically or just rabbinically. Alternatively, it's that they dispute over whether bird meat is allowed with milk and quote sources for the fact that we imply like this. Rabbi Yossi evidently holds that it's permitted to eat bird meat with milk, even rabbinically, as it cites a case where somebody held like this as he ate peacock heads served in milk. New Mishnah. Rennet is congealed milk found in an animal's abomasum stomach and is used to make cheese. The rennet of the animal that was owned by a non-Jewish person or that was improperly slaughtered cannot be eaten. If somebody curdled milk with the skin of the abomasum stomach, if there's enough skin to flavor the cheese, that's prohibited. If a kosher animal nursed from a non-kosher animal, its rennet is forbidden. If an animal with a defect nursed from a kosher animal, its rennet is permitted, as it was only just gathered in its stomach. The Gemara explains the reason the rennet of an animal of a non-Jewish person is problematic is if it's a kid that was possibly nursed from a non-kosher animal, which is more common than an animal with a defect. This doesn't apply by our own animals, as we don't typically have non-kosher animals running around. Some just say simply that an animal slaughtered by a non-Jewish person is considered to be improperly slaughtered according to our laws. In fact, the cheese made by a non-Jewish person would not be kosher, as it's presumably curdled with skin of the abomasum of an improperly slaughtered animal, and the rennet itself is also problematic. When we said the rennet in the abomasum of an animal with a defect is permitted, this should mean that the rennet in an animal that was improperly slaughtered should similarly be allowed, and it's explained that they did wind up retracting to permit this. Although the rule is it would not be allowed to curdle cheese with rennet or abomasum skin from an improperly slaughtered animal, but with rennet inside an actual improperly slaughtered animal, or an animal owned by a non-Jewish person, as we don't assume that they had any intents for idol worship, and with rennet in a kosher animal that nursed from an animal with a defect, and an animal with a defect that nursed from a kosher animal, the rennet would be allowed, as it's just gathered there as essentially just digested waste. New Mishnah. The Torah prohibits a person from eating forbidden fats and blood here. Forbidden fats can be stricter than blood, as there's me'ilah for benefiting from consecrated forbidden fats, and liability for improper intent, leftovers, and impurity. This does not apply by consecrated blood. Blood is stricter than forbidden fats, as the prohibition against eating blood applies to domesticated animals, undomesticated animals, and birds, whether they're kosher or non-kosher, while forbidden fats are only prohibited in kosher domesticated animals. The Gemara spent some time sourcing all of these principles and points. There are a few opinions as to how we know consecrated blood isn't subject to me'ila, and it additionally proves that improper intent, leftovers, and impurity don't apply by blood specifically, quoting some various verses. And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Chullin covers the laws of food impurities. The first Mishnah begins, different items could have a status of impurity, which includes foods, and they could then contaminate people with this impurity status, and therefore would make those people unable to enter the temple or eat of temple offerings. The smallest amount of food that can convey impurity is the volume of an egg, and the smallest amount of an animal carcass that can convey impurity is the volume of an olive. An animal's hide, gravy, sediment, meat shreds, bones, arteries, veins, nerves, and similar, horns, and the hooves all can combine to create a minimum of impurity of foods, but not of a carcass. Similarly, if somebody slaughters an impure animal for a non-Jewish person, if it's still convulsing, it conveys food impurity, but not carcass impurity, at least not until it dies fully. Essentially, this establishes that there are more forms of conveying food impurity than carcass impurity. Some disagree and say if the meat shreds are gathered to form an olive's volume, there is liability. The Gemara says it's only by food impurity and not by carcass impurity that certain protective animal parts, like the horns or bones, combine with the other meats they're protecting to form impurity minimums. This is sourced along with the fact that they don't apply by carcass impurities. Also, if a bone isn't acting in a protective manner, it's just acting as an extension to hold meats in place, for example, it's said it could give and receive food impurities, but can't combine to form minimums, which it sources, and also that a protective bone can do this and also combine to form minimums. It additionally debates as to how exactly we derive these principles. A number of verses on this topic are quoted and discussed. Additionally, some say that the extension of a food by specific bones, or even by produce, the stem of a fruit, for example, that it's not susceptible to become moistened through that area. This is relevant as the only way a produce can become susceptible to impurity is if it's moist. So it's a dispute between opinions if this is the case, and they again dispute this from verses. Some say the extension minimum in food is an olive's volume, and the protective parts have a minimum of a large bean's volume. Others say it can be smaller than these. It disputes this from some particularly quoted cases. Related, we know that a protective food layer that's on top of another protective food layer don't combine, for instance the peels of an onion, but if the protective layer is divided from the other, that's a disputed point. Anyways, it's said that a bone is sufficient to act as an extension to bring impurity into a location, but not so with hair. Others disagree and say a hair would be sufficient, as hair could pierce the hide, so it's not considered to be a protective layer on top of a protective layer. If we are establishing that hair could pierce hide, this could perhaps cause a bunch of issues with the writing of scrolls of tefillin and similar, but those are resolved as the piercing is not sufficient to cause issue for various reasons. This is spoken on further, and it essentially explains that a hair could cause an impurity extension if it's a hair wrapped among many other hairs, so that way it won't tear. Anyways, the Mishnah had stated that one of the meat parts that combines with the others to form impurity minimums was the gravy. There's some dispute as to what exactly this refers to. Some say it's fat that rises from cooked meat sauce. Others define it as the fluids that exude from cooked meats that then congeal. This is specifically if it's congealed, as this is dissimilar to principles of eating on Yom Kippur, where if it's not congealed, it's totally forbidden to be eaten, as there's just very different criteria for what's impermissible there as opposed to here. We then said that the sediments combine. Some define this as dregs at the bottom of the pot, others say it's the spices used to season meat that are in the pot. Somewhat related, it said if blood is hardened or forbidden fats are liquefied, they're still forbidden, which are then sources. Similarly, there's liability for consuming liquefied chametz on Passover. Also, if somebody consumes a liquefied, improperly slaughtered bird, there's still liability. There would be no impurity here if it had dissolved in the sun, as it had just putrefied, essentially. All of these three cases had to be specified, as chametz on Passover is more lenient than forbidden fats, as it had a period of permissibility, and forbidden fats is stricter than the bird case, as it's punished with kares, divine punishment. Chametz, unlike forbidden fats, has no exceptions, and chametz is more strict than the bird case, as chametz is punished with kares. The bird case is more stringent than the others, as it conveys impurity, unlike the other two, so all of these had to be specified. And then it additionally describes as to why any one of these can't be learnt from a combination of any two of them. Another point, by Sheret's creature impurities, Their liquefied forms are also forbidden. This is specified as its minimums are different than other impurities, as it goes by a lentil's volume when it's solid or liquefied. Related on this whole topic, untithed produce, sabbatical year produce, consecrated produce, and similar, when they're in a liquefied form, they still hold the same status as when they're in solid form, which is derived from this principle by Bikurim first fruit tithes, which itself is based on a verse. It similarly sources the principle's application by teruma tithes. Some say that by Bikurim and teruma tithes, the only liquids that retain this status are wines and oils. For instance, by Orla, the prohibition against harvesting a tree until its third year, some say this only applies in regards to liquids by wines and oils, and then by extension also to Bikurim tithes. Anyways, one of the foods mentioned that combined to create food impurities was meat scraps. Others actually define this as the cervical ligament, and they dispute sources. According to the opinion that it refers to meat scraps, we say that it can combine with other meats to create impurity minimums. However, as to if it itself is subject to food impurity, that's disputed. Some say it goes by if the person has intent to eat it, or it could be where the meat was ripped off earlier by some animal, so it's excluded from his intents as he severs it from the animal. Related, it's said that the beak and claws of a bird can combine or receive impurity, and can combine to form minimums. Some say this refers only to the lower part of the upper beak and the parts of the claw that are embedded into the flesh, as those parts specifically are somewhat edible. When we said that the horn of an animal combines for food impurity, this refers to the slightly edible part that bleeds if it's cut. We said if somebody slaughters an impure animal for a non-Jewish person and it's still moving around, it conveys only food impurity until it actually dies. Some say it would actually require intent to be fed to a non-Jewish person and preparation in water. As mentioned, foods are only susceptible to impurity if they're moistened. The reason this preparation of moisture is required, even though it will eventually have the severe impurity of being a carcass, is as meat shreds could be scraped off beforehand and never reach that status of corpse impurity. This is clarified as while the animal is convulsing, it's no longer in the status of a living animal, but it's not quite considered to be dead and a carcass yet. Although if an animal is slaughtered and it's still convulsing, it's a dispute if one would be liable for eating the limb of a living animal from it at that point. It essentially states, if an impure animal is slaughtered by a Jewish person, or a pure animal is slaughtered by a non-Jewish person, they're only subject to impurity if the animals are slaughtered, not if the pipes are pierced. It mentions if a non-Jewish person begins an act of slaughter and a Jewish man completes it, it would be valid, but not vice versa. Anyways, if an animal was slaughtered and it's convulsing, but it's not yet dead, if somebody wants to eat parts of it at that point, they should be cut off and salted and rinsed very well, and then he should wait until the animal actually dies, and then anybody could eat from it. As for the status of impurity, if somebody paused in the middle of the process, is this like if the animal was slaughtered, or like if the pipes were pierced? That's asked. It's said that for the animal to be susceptible to impurity, it actually needs to be fully slaughtered properly. Anyways, by this convulsing animal, if it swallowed something, it would convey impurity of foods, but as it doesn't convey impurity as a carcass, it's still slightly considered to be alive, so at this point there's still liability for bestiality. Anyways, we said the meat scraps form minimums of impurity. Some clarify this to only apply if they were intentionally gathered together. It's also said that if two half volumes of meat scraps are attached to the hide, they're just nullified as they're considered to be part of the hide. Some say this only applies if the hide was removed with a flaying knife. Others dispute this explanation and say that it makes no difference if these meat scraps were removed by an animal or by a knife, the hide would nullify them anyways. New Mishnah. The following creatures' skins have the same status as their flesh in regards to laws of impurity, as they're softer. Human skin, pig skin, some say wild pig skin, the skin of the hump of a tender camel, the skin of the head of a tender calf, the skin of hooves, the skin of an animal's female genitalia, the skin of a fetus, the skin under a fat tail, the skin of a bunch of the Sheretz creatures, which there's some debate as to what they translate to, so possibly a hedgehog, chameleon, lizard, and snail. Others exclude the lizard. All of these skins, if they're formed into leather or are spread out for leatherworking, they're pure, besides for human skin, which is impure even if it's turned into leather. Others disagree and say that none of the Sheretz creatures' hides are considered like flesh. The Gemara explains the basis for the fact that human skin is impure, which isn't a biblical concept, but it was instituted to prevent people from using their parents' skins for furniture, which is very disrespectful. Others say that regular human skin actually is biblically impure. There was a debate if there's impurity by the wild pig, which is based on the softness level of the skin. A camel hump is considered tender until it's born a burden. If it's old enough to carry one but hasn't yet, or it wasn't old enough to carry something but it had anyways, that's unresolved. It quotes some related discussion on this. There's debate as to when a calf is considered to be tender. Some say only in its first year and if it nurses. Others say as long as it nurses. It debates further if the head of such a calf can convey impurity. Anyways, it defines the place of the hooves and also discusses the skin of the different Sciatic creatures, quoting sources. We said these are considered pure if they're spread out and prepared for leatherworking. Specifically, this is if it's stepped on to begin this process, or if this hide is used to patch a basket, that would be enough to nullify it from impurity. The time period of leatherworking is defined as the time it takes to walk 4 mil. It mentions some other laws within this time period. Anyways, it said if a Roman legion enters a house, the house is then impure, as Roman legions always carried a few scalps of human skin with them, as seen in a few cases. New Mishnah: if somebody flayed an animal, whether it was pure or impure, whether it was a small or a large animal, if it's flayed to be used as a bedspread or a tablecloth, it conveys impurity during the flaying process up until the point where the flayed hide is larger than the sides that this person is holding onto. If the hide is flayed to be used as a flask, it gives impurity until the breast is flayed. If the man started flaying from the hind legs, in this case, then all of the flayed skin is considered attached in regards to impurity, both for giving and receiving impurity. By the skin on the neck, it's a dispute if it's either considered to be not attached or if it's considered to be attached until the entire carcass is flayed. The Gemara says, in the first case where the hide gives impurity until it's larger than the parts held onto by the sides, some say once it reaches this point, the entire remainder doesn't convey impurity, while others say a handbreadth remaining still would. It debates this from a few cases. Also, the amount of hide that's defined for this amount that's sufficient to be held is a doubled over handbreadth, so 2 handbreadths. It discusses this from some additional laws of impurity and essentially disputes as to whether our Mishnah is discussing biblical or rabbinic impurity based on a number of later discussions. It additionally discusses the status of neck skin by these laws and also some principles of impurity by types of ovens depending on the specific listed measurements. New Mishnah: if there's a piece of hide with an olive's volume of meat attached to it, if somebody touches a sliver protruding from the meat or a strand of hair on the side opposite the meat, they're impure. If there were 2 half-olive volumes of meat attached to a hide, Rabbi Ishmael says the meat transmits impurity through being carried, but not through contact, and Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't transmit impurity at all. Rabbi Akiva would agree that if 2 half-olive volumes of meat were stuck onto a splinter and removed, that would cause impurity, unlike when they're attached to the hide, as the hide just nullifies them. The Gemara says the first case, on an olive's volume of meat attached to a hide, it would only give off impurity if it had been torn off by an animal, as if it was cut off with a knife, it would just be nullified to the hide. This is additionally qualified in it disputes as to if we actually hold up this opinion. We said if 2 half-olive volumes of meat are attached to the hide, Rabbi Ishmael says they transmit impurity through being carried, but they don't transmit impurity through contact. It is agreed this applies if you touch the back of the hide, opposite the side with the actual meat. But if he touched the actual meat, some say as he's touching both halves at once, so he's impure, but others disagree, and it additionally discusses these principles along with sources as to whether this is the case. New Mishnah: if a marrow bone from a human corpse or from a leftover temple offering come in contact with a person, whether the marrow is sealed or punctured, the person is now impure. If there's a marrow bone from an improperly slaughtered animal or from a Sciatic creature, and somebody comes in contact with them, if they're sealed, they don't give off impurity. If they have any puncture at all, they do. This is sourced. The Gemara tries to conclude that there is impurity for coming in contact with a bone, but not so for being under the same roof. It is stated that as the bone marrow cannot regenerate the limb's flesh, it's not considered to be a limb, so it doesn't contaminate impurity by being under the same roof. The bone discussed here is one without an olive's volume of flesh or marrow, so the Mishnah is actually teaching us that marrow cannot regenerate flesh outside, that a bone that was left over from a temple offering has the same status as a leftover temple offering, and that by the bone of the improperly slaughtered animal or by the Sciatic creature, it only gives off impurity if it's actually punctured. Some actually just redefine the entire case, saying that marrow could actually regenerate a limb, but part of the bone was scraped away so it couldn't, or alternatively, it's just that the case is that we hold marrow can regenerate a limb, and there is an olive's volume of marrow on the bone, and it's just saying that when it says contact impurity, that actually just refers to impurity from being under the same roof, as he holds that that's just the same category as contact. It's spent some time sourcing this principle. That's additionally discussed essentially as to whether we do hold that a hidden impurity can penetrate past its covering. In the end, it's effectively just a dispute. Some hold that contact and roof impurity are 2 separate categories, others say they combine. We said that an improperly slaughtered animal or a Sciatic creature's bone only transmits impurity if it's punctured. This is then sourced, and also it's held by some that we hold that something that lacks puncturing but hasn't yet had this occur is not considered as if the action is lacking, Meaning if somebody has such a bone and plans on puncturing it but just hasn't gotten around to doing so yet, it would still give off impurity. New Mishnah. By the egg of a Sheretz creature, the embryo inside is inaccessible as there's a shell around it, so it doesn't give off impurity. If the egg is cracked in the slightest amount, it would give off impurity. If there's a mouse carcass that's half flesh and half dirt, if somebody touches the flesh half, there's impurity. If somebody touches the earth half, he is pure. Others say that if somebody touches the earth opposite the flesh, then he's impure. The Gemara spends some time sourcing this principle by the egg. We said if a mouse carcass is half flesh and half earth, only the flesh half gives off impurity. This would only apply if it itself was entirely flesh. Others say that's the only way the following opinion would say there's impurity by then touching the opposite side. It's said that the mouse of the sea, which is a type of fish, doesn't give off impurity, which it then sources. It additionally discusses this definition. Anyways, in addition to the toad being a Sheretz creature that gives off impurity, it said this includes the toad-snake crossbreed, a type of lizard, and the salamander. It remarks on a few other rare species of animals and also on the people of certain regions. It's also said that the toad-snake crossbreed animals shouldn't be possible, as that's mixing two totally different species, but it's just a miraculous creature. New Mishnah. Anyways, the limbs and flesh that dangle from an animal convey food impurity even while attached, so long as they were moistened beforehand. If the animal is slaughtered, it's a dispute if they're moistened sufficiently by the blood. If the animal dies without slaughter, dangling flesh needs to be moistened to give impurity, while dangling limbs give impurity as they're the limb of a living animal, but not as the limb of an improperly slaughtered animal. However, others just say they're pure. The Gemara says, we said that dangling limbs and flesh give off food impurity. This is where the limb cannot regenerate, and impurity as an improperly slaughtered animal isn't included, which is just based on a verse. It additionally discusses the sources for these principles of impurity along with the remaining points. The dispute on if a slaughtered animal's dangling limb could have impurity is essentially as to whether the entire body can be an extension for the dangling limb. Alternatively, the dispute is on whether an item with two parts, if the smaller part is lifted and the larger part doesn't also come up, if they're considered to be one entity or not. This is also seen by some other cases. Alternatively, the dispute is on whether an extension can prepare an entity for impurity by being moist. Alternatively, they debate if it can be prepared as moist before it was intended as a food, which it proves is a disputed point from another case. Or if that the case is where the blood was wiped off between the cutting of the pipes, so it's disputed if the blood is slaughter blood or not. Or lastly, they dispute as to whether it's only a valid act of slaughter that can prepare something for impurity, not just regular blood. There are a bunch of unresolved points on this. The practical difference between impurity of the limb of a living animal and of an improperly slaughtered animal is by flesh that separates from this limb, where it'll only convey impurity by the latter one of an improperly slaughtered animal. It actually disputes this principle from a bunch of cases. Some cite a principle that if some food conveys a severe degree of impurity while not being used as a food, it's only being used as a chair or something or some wood, it still needs to be prepared as a food to give off impurity by being moistened beforehand. This is then used to resolve a bunch of specific listed cases. There was an ending opinion that the dangling flesh of an animal that died is just pure. It sources this opinion. Others, however, dispute it. New Mishnah. The limb or flesh that dangle from a person are pure. If the person dies, the dangling flesh is pure, while the dangling limb is impure as the limb of a living person, and not as the limb of a corpse. Others disagree and simply say it's pure. The Gemara says this latter opinion was referring to limbs of a corpse in general, not necessarily hanging ones, as he says that generally the only way the limb severed from a corpse can give off impurity is if there's an olive's volume of flesh on it. It finds supports for this view, as others hold that a limb severed from a corpse doesn't convey impurity as a limb. The practical difference between a limb severed from a living person and from a corpse is by a small piece that separates from the limb of a corpse. It would be impure, but this wouldn't apply if it was separated from the limb of a living person. And that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Tractate Chullin covers some laws of animal tithes after slaughter. The first Mishnah says, as it states in this verse, there is an obligation after slaughtering an animal to give the foreleg, the jaws, and the abomasum stomach to the Kohen. This applies inside and outside of Israel. It applies inside and outside of the temple, and it applies to unconsecrated animals, but not to consecrated animals. This last point is based on a verse. All consecrated animals that have a permanent blemish before they're consecrated and were redeemed towards money instead, they still have the firstborn tithe, and these animal part tithes apply. Although as they were redeemed onto money, they're still unconsecrated to the point that they can be shorn, used for work, and their offspring and milk can be used. They can viably be slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, they cannot be substituted, and if they died before they were redeemed, onto money, they can still be redeemed. The exceptions to this are the Bechor and the Meiser offerings, which if they're blemished before consecration, they're still fully consecrated, as their consecration uniquely takes place from birth. If an animal's consecration went before the blemish, or it was a temporary blemish before the consecration that then developed into a full blemish, which were then redeemed, they aren't subject to the Bechor tithe or these listed animal part gifts. They don't become unconsecrated, meaning they can't be shorn or worked with, and their offspring and milk are still prohibited, and there's liability for slaughtering them outside the temple. They can be substituted, and if they died before they're redeemed, they must be buried. The Gemara mentions that we said these gifts to the Kohen, the foreleg, the jaws, and the abomasum, don't apply to consecrated animals, and that's sourced from a verse. This was necessary to state, as consecrated animals are subject to requirements to have the animal's breast and thigh gifted to the Kohen, so it needs to state this, that this doesn't also apply here by these unique 3 gifts. It additionally discusses the validity of this comparison, and essentially explains that as these gifts are required from purchased or orphaned unconsecrated animals, male goats for instance, these aren't subject to the tithe of the breast and thigh, but that would apply if it was with consecrated animals, so you'd think the gifts could apply here also, hence the need for the verse. It explains the comparison doesn't work in reverse, that an unconsecrated animal which needs to have these gift parts given still doesn't require the breast and thigh parts to be given to the Kohen. Some say if these Kohanic gifts are damaged or eaten before being given, there's no liability for payment. Possibly, as they don't have a specific claimant, it tries to dispute this by quoting a number of similar cases. It tries to disprove this further from some additional instances regarding Meiser and Teruma and other tithes and similar, but it's largely unsuccessful. We said that these gifts go to the Kohen. It's a dispute if they can also be taken by a Levi, based on whether the terminology used in scripture on this topic is one that can also be used to refer to Levium. It tries to prove this from a lengthy case which involves quoting a number of verses to explain the application of a bunch of different tithes, but in the end it just explains its teaching that the first sharing tithe applies to Levium also, along with Kohanim. It tries to prove this from a bunch of other cases. In the end, we say we're not really sure if the used expression encompasses the Levium, so we just don't collect these gifts from them, and we also rule that if somebody damages or eats these gift parts, he doesn't need to repay them. As to whether the used terminology encompasses a female Kohen, that's also disputed, but as quoted, many of the sages would say it was permissible. In fact, it rules we do not take these gifts from a Levi, there's no liability for damaging or eating these gifts. They can be given to a female Kohen. And also, if a female Levi gives birth to a firstborn, her son doesn't need to have the Pidyon Haben redemption tithe paid. Anyways, this animal part gift tithe applies to domesticated animals and not to undomesticated animals. As for a crossbreed, part goat and part sheep animal, that would have these requirements, while a part goat, part deer crossbreed would be exempt from this. This was similarly discussed, disputing if this animal needs to have its blood covered after slaughter, regarding a male deer that had a child with a female goat in earlier chapters, as we're unsure whether we go after the genealogy of the father, and also as for if the scriptural word seh, which means goat, also includes reference to the half-goat. Some say this hybrid animal needs to have half of these gifts given. Some say it's not required at all, and they dispute based on verses. New Mishnah. If a Bechor tithe becomes mixed up with 100 other animals, if they're all slaughtered by 100 different people, they're all exempt from this gift obligation of the foreleg, jaw, and abomasum. If they're all slaughtered by one person, only one of them is exempt. Similarly, if somebody slaughters an animal for a Kohen or a non-Jewish person, they're exempt from having to bring these gift parts. If somebody's partnered with either of them, they have to make a mark on the meat to show it's partially owned by a Kohen or a non-Jewish person. If a Kohen sold an animal to somebody, saying he's selling the animal besides for the gift parts, the buyer is exempt from needing to give those, as the Kohen already owns them. If somebody purchases the innards of a cow and the Kohanic gift parts were included, the buyer should give them to a Kohen, and the price is not reduced by the butcher. However, if the purchase was by weight, then the price would be reduced. The Gemara says, by the Bechor being mixed with the other animals, the reason the Kohen has no rights to demand the Bechor tithe from one of them is as this is where the Kohen had sold it to somebody and it was blemished. When it said that somebody who slaughters an animal for a Kohen or for a non-Jewish person, he's exempt from giving these gifts, that was specified as it's saying the claim is on the actual slaughterer. It's been some time sourcing the fact that Kohanim don't need to give the Kohanic gifts and some related incidents on this. Some say, however, that a Kohen who slaughters animals commercially and doesn't separate the gifts for another Kohen should be excommunicated, and it gives instances of this. It is also said that the parts should be given to a single Kohen, besides for the jaws, which can be given to two Kohanim, unless it's from an ox with very large parts, where it could have its parts divided between Kohanim. Some say it's forbidden to eat of an animal that didn't have its gifts separated. Some even say it has the status as untithed produce, but we don't hold like this opinion. Some say that these Kohanic gifts must be eaten in the same manner as kings eat, which is described as being roasted and with mustard. Also, there are those that held that there are 24 Kohanic gifts total, and a Kohen who isn't an expert in the laws shouldn't receive these gifts. Others dispute this. As for the manner these gifts should be taken, it, in the end, was said to be gluttonous to grab at portions, and some would even just not take at all, besides for on the day before Yom Kippur, which was done solely to establish themselves as being a Kohen. Also, if a Kohen is well known and will probably be receiving these gifts, he can preemptively forward them to a poor person who needs food. It gives an instance of where this was done, along with related points on the importance of teaching students to have good character. We said if somebody is partnered with a Kohen or a non-Jewish person, they need to mark the meat to show it's exempt from these Kohanic gifts. This would not be necessary by the non-Jewish person if he's actually just sitting by the store, as he would dispute the prices charged by the butcher, while a Kohen probably wouldn't do so. If somebody's selling a disqualified offering, its meat doesn't need to be marked if it's being sold from one's house so that people know it's from a disqualified offering. If it's sold in a market, it must be marked. If a person is partnered with a Kohen or a non-Jewish person on just the head, or just the leg, or just the innards of an animal, it's disputed if he's exempt from the gift or just that individual portion, or actually all of the portions. It holds it only goes by the individual portion, and it additionally explains the case along with giving the expanded list of the 24 Kohanic gifts, which were mentioned earlier, which are essentially these three mentioned here, and then all of the various parts of all the types of offerings that can be eaten by Kohanim, being the different types of meat offerings, the animals, and all the flour offerings. If a Kohen sold an animal to somebody saying he can have the head, but the Kohen's keeping the body, it's disputed as to if the jaws would be necessary to be gifted to the Kohen, as the main part of the animal is actually owned by the Kohen here. It's explained we go by the individual part, so it would need to be given. If the Kohen sells the animal, except for the gift portions, he retains them. There's dispute as to if the Kohen said, on condition the gifts are his, as to if that constitutes a viable exclusion of these. Now, if somebody buys innards from a butcher, we said it's the buyer's responsibility to return the gift portions. This is if the buyer weighed them himself. If the butcher weighed the innards, it's a dispute as to if it's the butcher's responsibility to give the gifts, or if it's still the buyer's responsibility. This is essentially a dispute as to whether these Kohanic gifts can be legally stolen, as to whether the butcher has committed an act of theft by weighing them. New Mishnah. If somebody converts to Judaism and he owned a cow, if it was slaughtered before he converted, he doesn't need to give these Kohanic gift parts. If it was slaughtered after he converted, he would need to give them. If he's not sure where the slaughter was, he's exempt, as the burden of proof goes on the person trying to take the property. The Gemara says this is one opinion. There's a different opinion by field charity and also by challah tithes that says in a case of doubt, the owner would actually need to pay. The difference is explained to be that the field charity is in a presumptive state of obligation, unlike this, which is in a presumptive state of leniency. And also, this is a monetary matter by the Kohanic gifts, where there's leniency, but by a prohibition, by the chalatai, there's a stringency. This is additionally sourced, and it qualifies for the principles of this field charity. We said earlier the Kohanim shouldn't grab for the Kohanic gift portions. There was a case where a bag of money was gifted to a study hall and a sage grabbed it, but that was only done to give it to charity, or it's possibly just that he was an important person, so it was viewed as acceptable. New Mishnah. By the Kohanic gifts, the foreleg is defined as from the carpus to the shoulder blade, which is also relevant by other offerings, as the corresponding area around this is defined as the thigh. Others disagree and say that the thigh is from the tarsus until the knee joint. The jaw is defined as from the joint of the jaw until the opening of the trachea. The Gemara sources these measurements and organs from scriptural verses. It said that the jaw would include any wool or hair, and the abomasum would include the forbidden fats and the milk inside. It also sources the principle that the foreleg given here and by offerings is specifically the right one, as it's the most distinguished. There's some dispute as to how much of the trachea is included with the jaw. Some say it goes even lower to the place of slaughter, which is based on how much of the trachea can be severed in slaughter, as there's some opinions on that. And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Tractate Chullin continues going through the laws on the Kohanic animal part gift tithes. The first Mishnah says, another portion of an animal that must be given to a Kohen, as stated in this verse, is part of the fleece. This applies inside and outside of Israel, when the temple does and does not exist, and only with unconsecrated animals. The obligation to give the foreleg, jaws, and abomasum to a Kohen, as discussed in the prior chapter, is more stringent than this, as it applies to both cattle and sheep, while this applies to just sheep. The obligation to give the fleece is stricter, as it applies to many animals. Beis Shammai says 2, Beis Hillel says 5. There is dispute by Beis Hillel if this means the gift is given when a mana and a half worth of wool is shorn. Others say it's given when any amount is shorn. The amount given to Kohanim is the weight of 5 salaim coins in Judea, which is the equivalent of 10 salaim in Galilee. The wool must be white and clean, and there should be enough to make a small garment. If the owner had dyed the wool before giving it, he's exempt from this gift. If he'd only whitened it, he'd still need to give it over. If somebody purchases a fleece from a non-Jewish person, he's exempt from giving the fleece gift to the Kohanim. If somebody buys fleece from a Jewish person, if he left some wool over with the seller must give the gift. If he did not, the buyer must give the gift. If the seller had brown and white sheep and somebody purchased just the brown sheep or just the male sheep, the buyer and the seller both need to give their own fleece portions. The Gemara sources the fact that this has no application by consecrated animals. Some actually say this exemption applies if the fleece itself on the animal was consecrated, which is discussed. There are various interpretations as to what exactly is being argued on by this case, quoting a number of verses that have their interpretations disputed. This dispute essentially revolves around whether we derive the laws of this fleece gift from the terumotais, as if we do, we know we can't separate fleeces from new sheep for old ones, so if fleeces accumulate over many years, there's no obligation to give a fleece gift from there. If it's not derived from terumotais, then this would be done. It additionally discusses difficulties with this comparison. Additionally, it mentions there were several lenient rulings made that this fleece gift and also the gifts from the prior chapter of the foreleg, jaws, and abomasum only have application within the land of Israel. Also, some other lenient rulings: it's permissible to study Torah while in a state of impurity, and also by the laws of forbidden plant mixtures, there's only liability if somebody simultaneously sows wheat, barley, and grapeseed in one motion. Additionally, when we compared the fleece and animal part gifts, we didn't mention that the fleece is stricter as it applies to animals with a defect, as this accords with the opinion that animals with a defect don't need their fleece given as a Kohanic gift, which is sourced. We had also stated that the obligation of the fleece gift only applies specifically to sheep. This is sourced from the fact that specific words are used in scripture by this topic. It also disputes as to how many sheep are needed for this gift. As mentioned, Beis Shammai said 2, while Beis Hillel said 5, and it actually brings a third opinion of a Rabbi Yossi, who says it actually goes by 4 sheep. Some actually wound up ruling like this last opinion. Some said the amount shorn for this tithe to apply would be in any amount. There's a few opinions as to how much exactly this is. Some said a total of a mana and a half, so long as everything is evenly divided into 5. Others said 60 selah in total, and the owner gives 1 selah as the gift. Others said 6 selahim, and the owner gives 5 of them to the Kohanim. And others just literally say any amount needs to have this tithe taken from it. It additionally debates between these opinions from a number of related discussions on laws of field charity minimums and related. The reason the wool must be whitened is so that the weight is honest and doesn't account for dirt in the wool to throw off the measurements. The fact that there must be enough to make a small garment is then sourced. It also lists the individuals who held the remaining points from the Mishnah, that the fleece must be given by the one who took it or retained it by the sale. It's explained to be in accordance with a similar opinion in the last chapter on purchasing cow innards from a seller in regards to these Kohanic gifts, which essentially established that a person doesn't mean to sell these gifts to a Kohen, so if the seller retains them, he must still give the gift, and then this would also apply here by the fleece gifts. And that's the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12, the final chapter of Tractate Chullin, covers a bit of a unique law regarding the laws of animals, the principle of sending away a mother bird. The first Mishnah says, in these verses, it essentially establishes that if a person wants to take eggs from a nest, the mother bird must first be sent away. This principle is called Shaluach HaKan. This applies both inside and outside of the land of Israel. It applies when the temple does and does not exist, and it applies only to unconsecrated birds. The obligation to cover an animal's blood after slaughter is stricter than this, as it applies to animals and birds, while this applies to just birds, and that applies to both domesticated and captured birds, while this applies only to captured wild birds, such as geese or chicken in an orchard. If these birds nest in a house, or they're Herodian doves, for example, they're exempt from needing to have their mother sent away. Also, by non-kosher birds, this obligation to send away the mother bird does not apply. If a non-kosher bird is sitting on kosher bird eggs, or a kosher bird is sitting on non-kosher bird eggs, this obligation does not apply. It's a debate if there's an obligation to send away the male partridge, as it sits on eggs similar to a female. The Gemara says, chapters 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, and 12 of this tractate all begin with the same points, discussing the relevant obligations and their application inside and outside of Israel, inside and outside of the temple, and with consecrated and unconsecrated animals. It says, the only real necessity of teaching that these apply inside and outside of Israel was by the prior chapter to reject an opinion that the fleece Kohanic gift doesn't apply outside of Israel. And the only purpose of specifying that all of these apply when the temple does and does not exist was for the point in chapter 5 to not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day, to show this applies even when the temple doesn't exist, in spite of the fact that this topic was discussed by the topic of temple offerings. And it was necessary to teach all of these by consecrated and unconsecrated animals to show that by the sciatic nerve, discussed in chapter 7, that this would apply even when it's consecrated, in spite of the fact that that's pretty obvious that it would apply there too. The reason the obligation of sending away a mother bird doesn't apply to consecrated animals is as that's not sent away, it's brought to the temple treasury. It derives from this that if a bird kills a person, it wouldn't be necessary to send it away to claim its eggs, as in this case the mother bird must at this point instead be brought to court to be stoned. This is where the guilty verdict wasn't yet concluded, hence why it needs to be brought to court. It disputes as to what the exact circumstance of the case of a consecrated bird here would even be. It suggested it could be somebody consecrated doves for Ola offerings from his dovecot, which then escaped, or a hen which is designated for temple upkeep, which then escaped. It disputes the validity of this latter one as to if it could even be referring to a bird designated for temple upkeep. Anyways, we said this obligation to send away the mother bird doesn't apply to domesticated, settled birds. It spent some time sourcing this, and we mentioned Herodian doves as an example, as those are considered to be fully domesticated. It spent some time defining exactly what type of bird this is. We also said the obligation only applies to kosher birds. This is sourced based on specific words used in scripture which refer specifically to kosher birds. This is additionally discussed, and it also sources the fact that if a kosher bird is sitting on non-kosher eggs, in spite of the fact that it's a kosher bird, it nevertheless wouldn't be necessary to send the mother away. There are a number of specific unresolved points on this, such as what if there's an interposition between the mother and the eggs, and what exactly would constitute this, what about feathers or infertile eggs, etc. If a kosher dove is found sitting on the eggs of a kosher pigeon, or vice versa, that's disputed, and it seems to say one would be exempt from sending away the mother bird here. We said there was a debate by a male partridge as it roosts on the eggs similar to a female. This dispute is sourced, and it explains the point applies specifically to the male partridge. New Mishnah. If a mother bird was flying above a nest, somebody is only obligated to send it away if its wings are still touching the nest. This obligation still applies even if there's only one egg. It would not apply if there were fledglings or infertile eggs. The Gemara sources these points. Some say if a bird is sitting between two tree limbs above her nest. Some say if the branches would be removed in theory. If she'd fall on her nest if they were removed, she must be sent away in this case. However, others dispute this, and there's some additional discussion. New Mishnah. If somebody sent the mother bird away, no matter how many times it returns, it must still be repeatedly sent away. If somebody wants to take the mother bird and the eggs, he still needs to send away the mother first. The Gemara spent some time sourcing these principles. New Mishnah. If somebody takes the mother bird while it's still on its young, Rabbi Yehuda says he gets lashes and he doesn't need to send the bird away. The sages say he does need to send the bird away, but he doesn't get lashes. There's a general rule. Any positive commandment in the Torah that exists to rectify a negative commandment, there's no lashes for violating that negative commandment. The Gemara debates as to then why Rabbi Yehuda would hold there is lashes anyway in this case. It essentially is as he holds this positive commandment to send away the mother bird isn't an obligation which resolves a negative commandment, as it's meant to be done to begin with. This is additionally sourced. Anyway, some particularities. The bird must be sent away until it departs from this person's custody. It's a dispute as to whether the bird must be sent away by its legs or by its wings, which is discussed further. It gives some incidents of the performance of this obligation. New Mishnah, last one of the chapter, and the tractate. A person can't even take a mother bird from its young, not even if he needs this bird to purify a Metzora leper for his offering. And if this mitzvah, which winds up having the person lose about a single Isser coin, it's said about it so that it will be good for you and you will live long, then how much more so would this apply by difficult commandments of the Torah? The Gemara says, all obligations of the Torah that are written with their reward is tied to the resurrection of the dead, as the long life promised by this obligation and also of honoring one's parents is in reference to the world to come, and the resurrection of the dead. This is seen by a case of a boy who was sent to take eggs from a mother bird by his father, and he died while doing so. Harm was able to come to him even though he was doing a mitzvah, as it was a time of particular danger, and also it said that mitzvahs don't always have the rewards given in this world. This is the reason that the sage Acher became a heretic, as he viewed this incident, or possibly the mutilation of the sage Chutzpitz the Metorgaman by the Romans, and he thought that no reward comes for doing good deeds, but in actuality the reward for doing good is often in the world to come. And that's the end of chapter 12 and the entire Tractate Chullin. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. There are extremely particular laws on slaughtering an animal. The essential principle is that it be done in a manner that causes as little pain to the animal as physically possible. So there are particularities like the knife being incredibly sharp without any serrations. It must be moved in a precise and specific manner without pressing downwards and without pausing, and only in a certain area, severing only specific pipes. For this reason, animal and fowl meat are only kosher if either slaughtered yourself according to the proper laws of shechita, slaughter, or more likely as purchased from a recognized and qualified shechet. Fish have none of these specific requirements of shechita. There are some parts of an animal that cannot be eaten. These are mainly the sciatic nerve, the gid hanoshe, certain forbidden fats, and any blood at all. Because of these strict prohibitions against eating blood in any form, it's necessary to heavily salt and rinse meat before cooking it to remove all the blood. A slaughtered animal can't have any invalidating defects. If it does, it's not kosher. This would be like a puncture in one of its major organs, or some specific diseases or lesions. The word for an animal like this is terefa. Some animals are kosher, others are not. A kosher animal is one which chews its cud and has split hooves, as mentioned within Scripture. A kosher fish is one with fins and scales, as mentioned within Scripture. The Scripture just gives a list of birds which aren't kosher, although the common denominator seems to be birds of prey with some caveats. Some species of locusts are actually kosher, although they're not really eaten anymore due to difficulty in identifying the correct species. Mixtures of meat and dairy are strictly prohibited. This prohibition applies to cooking them together, benefiting from them, or eating them. The generally accepted custom is to wait 6 hours after eating meat to eat dairy, and 1 after eating dairy to eat meat. This prohibition against forbidden mixtures would also extend towards meat and dairy utensils and vessels. Whenever somebody claims the eggs from a wild bird, the mother bird must first be sent away. This principle is called Shiluach HaKan. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.